the annals of Westeros history, few names evoke such powerful emotions as Daenerys Targaryen. Born during a storm that would mirror the tempest of her life, she emerged from exile as the last of her bloodline. From a frightened girl sold into marriage to the mother of dragons, who would shake the very foundations of the known world, her journey spans continents and transforms kingdoms. This is the complete chronicle of Daenerys Stormborn, a tale of dragons and destiny, of liberation and loss, of how the last Targaryen rose to unimaginable heights only to face the tragic weight of her ancestors' legacy. The year 284, after conquest, marked one of the most tumultuous periods in Westerosi history. As Robert's rebellion raged across the Seven Kingdoms and the Targaryen dynasty faced its darkest hour, on the ancient island fortress of Dragonstone, where her ancestors had first set foot in Westeros centuries before, Queen Rhaella Targaryen endured the final stages of a pregnancy that would bring forth the last known member of House Targaryen. The night of the birth proved as violent as the times themselves, with a summer storm of unprecedented fury battering the castle walls and sending waves crashing against the volcanic rocks below. As thunder shook the very foundations of the ancestral seat and lightning illuminated the Dragon Lord's ancient home, Daenerys Targaryen drew her first breath. The storm's intensity earned her the epithet that would follow her throughout her life: Daenerys Stormborn, a name that seemed to prophesy the tempestuous path that lay ahead. Her mother, Queen Rhaella, had fled King's Landing with young Prince Viserys after the sack of the capital, carrying the unborn child who represented the future of their bloodline. The queen's labors proved difficult and dangerous, weakened as she was by years of her husband's cruelty and the trauma of flight from their burning kingdom. Within days of Daenerys' birth, tragedy struck the royal family once more. Queen Rhaella, having spent her strength bringing her daughter into a world that no longer welcomed Targaryens, succumbed to childbed fever. Her death left the newborn princess and her brother Viserys as orphans in a hostile world, with only loyal retainers to protect them from Robert Baratheon's vengeful pursuit. The new king had sworn to see every last Targaryen dead, viewing them as threats to his newly won throne, and his agents scoured the known world for any trace of the Dragon King's surviving children. Sir Willem Darry, a knight whose loyalty to House Targaryen transcended the dynasty's fall, took responsibility for the royal orphans. Understanding that Dragonstone offered no sanctuary against Robert's forces, he spirited the children across the narrow sea to the free cities of Essos. There, among the merchant princes and sellsword companies of a continent that cared little for Westerosi politics, the last Targaryens began their long exile. The knight had salvaged what he could from the royal treasury, enough to maintain a modest household and preserve some dignity for the children he protected. During these early years, Daenerys knew nothing but the kindness of Sir Willem and the growing strangeness of her brother Viserys. The boy, barely 8 years old when their world collapsed, had been shaped by trauma and loss in ways that would haunt him forever. He remembered the Iron Throne, the Red Keep's grandeur, and the reverence once shown to their family name. These memories became both his treasure and his curse, feeding an obsession with reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his, while twisting his personality into something increasingly bitter and unstable. The children moved frequently during these years, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. From Braavos to Lys, from Myr to Tyrosh, they wandered the free cities like ghosts of a fallen kingdom. Sir Willem did his best to educate them in the manner befitting royal children, teaching them High Valyrian, the history of their house, and the noble bearing expected of dragons. Daenerys learned of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, of Balerion the Black Dread, and the other great dragons that once soared above Westeros with the doom of Valyria that had destroyed their ancestral homeland, but spared the Targaryens alone. When Daenerys reached her 6th year, their protector's strength finally failed him. Sir Willem Darry died in the house they had rented in Braavos, taking with him the last of the old world's stability and leaving the children truly alone. His death marked the beginning of their descent into poverty and desperation, as the servants he had employed quickly stole what remained of value and abandoned the royal orphans to fend for themselves. The property was sold to pay debts, and Viserys found himself responsible for his infant sister with neither resources nor skills to provide for them. What followed were years of increasing degradation and wandering. Viserys, desperate to maintain some semblance of royal dignity, would sell their mother's crown and other precious artifacts piece by piece to survive. Each sale wounded his pride and fed his growing resentment, particularly toward his sister, whom he increasingly blamed for their circumstances. He would often remind Daenerys that their mother had died giving birth to her, planting seeds of guilt that would take root in the young girl's mind. The weight of these accusations, combined with his unpredictable temper, created an atmosphere of fear that dominated her childhood. The brother who had once protected her became her greatest source of terror. Viserys developed a violent streak that he justified as necessary discipline, claiming that he needed to prepare Daenerys for the royal life that awaited them once they reclaimed their throne. His rages, which he called waking the dragon, would descend without warning and for the slightest provocation. A spilled cup, a mispronounced word in High Valyrian, or simple childish behavior could trigger hours of verbal abuse or physical violence. Daenerys learned to watch his moods constantly, to make herself small and quiet when the madness crept into his violet eyes. Throughout these dark years, they depended on the charity of others for survival. Former loyalists would sometimes provide temporary shelter or small gifts. But as the years passed and Robert's reign stabilized, even these sources of support dwindled. The fallen Targaryens became curiosities at best, unwelcome reminders of a bygone era that most preferred to forget. They stayed in increasingly squalid accommodations, sometimes sleeping in servants' quarters or abandoned buildings, always moving when their welcome wore out or their small funds ran dry. By the time Daenerys reached adolescence, their situation had become truly desperate. Viserys had sold every valuable possession their family had possessed, down to their mother's wedding ring. His schemes for reclaiming the throne grew more elaborate and unrealistic with each passing year. Fed by wine and the fevered dreams of a broken mind, he would speak for hours of the great army he would someday raise, of the nobles who would flock to their banner, of the dragons that would return to serve the rightful king. These fantasies provided him temporary escape from their grim reality, but did nothing to improve their circumstances. Daenerys, meanwhile, had grown into a beautiful young woman despite the hardships of their exile. Her silver-gold hair and violet eyes marked her clearly as a Targaryen, and she had inherited the ethereal beauty that ran in their bloodline. This beauty, which should have been her protection and pride, instead became another source of vulnerability. Viserys began to view his sister not as family to be protected, but as an asset to be leveraged in his endless quest for power and restoration. Their salvation, if it could be called that, came in the form of Magister Illyrio Mopatis of Pentos. The enormously wealthy merchant prince had his own reasons for interesting himself in the last Targaryens, though these motives remained carefully hidden behind layers of seeming generosity. He offered the siblings sanctuary in his great manse, providing them with fine clothes, good food, and comfortable apartments for the first time in years. To Daenerys, who had known only poverty and fear, Illyrio's palace seemed like a dream made real. The Magister's household offered the young princess her first taste of feminine companionship and guidance. The servants treated her with kindness and respect, teaching her how to dress her hair in the Tyroshi fashion and applying subtle cosmetics that enhanced her natural beauty. For the first time since childhood, Daenerys began to feel something approaching happiness, though Viserys' presence still cast a shadow over her days. His moods had grown even more unpredictable in Illyrio's house, perhaps because the contrast between their host's obvious wealth and their own dependence highlighted his failure to reclaim their birthright. During their stay in Pentos, Daenerys began to display certain peculiarities that marked her as different from ordinary people. She seemed unaffected by extreme heat, preferring baths that scalded the servants who prepared them, and showing no discomfort when standing near blazing fires. These small signs of her unusual nature went largely unnoticed, dismissed as personal preference rather than recognition of something deeper in her Targaryen blood. The dragon lords of old had possessed strange qualities, an affinity for fire and heat that set them apart from common men, and this ancient legacy stirred within the last daughter of their line. Yet even in the relative comfort of Illyrio's protection, Daenerys remained a prisoner of her brother's obsession and her own fear. Viserys had begun to speak more frequently of marriage, of the alliances he would forge to win back their throne. He would examine his sister with a calculating gaze that made her deeply uncomfortable, speaking of her beauty and her royal blood as commodities to be traded. The girl who had once played with her brother, who remembered brief moments of kindness from him in their early exile, watched as the last remnants of that loving sibling disappeared beneath layers of madness and desperate ambition. The transformation was complete when Viserys began to fondle her inappropriately under the guise of examining how she had grown, claiming it was his royal right and duty to ensure she was developing into a suitable bride for the alliance he planned to forge. These violations of her person and dignity were accompanied by threats and justifications, as Viserys explained that she owed him everything, including her body if necessary, for the years he had protected and provided for her. Daenerys learned to endure these examinations in silence, understanding that resistance would only provoke worse treatment. In the early months of 297 after conquest, Magister Illyrio's long-laid plans finally came to fruition. He arranged for representatives of Khal Drogo, the most powerful Dothraki warlord, to visit Pentos and inspect the Targaryen princess as a potential bride. The Dothraki, fierce horse warriors who roamed the grasslands of central Essos, had never crossed the narrow sea to trouble Westeros. But their reputation for savagery and strength was legendary. Viserys, desperate for any alliance that might restore him to power, eagerly agreed to the match despite having no true understanding of what such a union would mean for his sister. The night before Khal Drogo's arrival, Viserys made his intentions crystal clear to Daenerys in terms that revealed the full depth of his moral degradation. He told her explicitly that he would let all 40,000 of Drogo's men rape her if it meant getting his throne back, that her suffering was a price he was willing to pay for his restoration. These words, spoken with casual cruelty, shattered whatever remaining illusions Daenerys might have harbored about her brother's love or protection. She realized that to him, she was nothing more than a bargaining chip, valuable only for what her marriage might bring him. When the great Khal arrived at Illyrio's manse the following day, Daenerys got her first glimpse of the man who would become her husband. Khal Drogo was everything the stories had suggested and more, a warrior in the prime of life whose presence seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. His copper skin was decorated with intricate scars that told the story of countless battles, and his long hair had never been cut, proclaiming to all who saw him that he had never known defeat. He examined Daenerys with the same cold assessment that Viserys had begun to use, but there was something different in his gaze, a recognition that she was more than mere merchandise. The Khal's approval came not in words, for he spoke no language the Targaryens understood, but in his willingness to conclude the bargain with Magister Illyrio. In exchange for the Targaryen princess, he would provide Viserys with the army he sought, 40,000 Dothraki warriors to cross the narrow sea and reclaim the Iron Throne. The agreement was sealed with traditional gifts and ceremonies, binding Daenerys to a fate she had no power to refuse. Her wedding dress, a gift from Illyrio, seemed more like a funeral shroud as servants prepared her for the journey to her new life among the Horse Lords. As the final preparations were made for her departure from the only home she had known in years, Daenerys understood that her childhood, such as it had been, was ending forever. The frightened girl who had cowered before her brother's rages was about to become a Khaleesi, a queen among the Dothraki, though she could not yet imagine what that transformation would require of her. The dragons that decorated Illyrio's halls seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as if the ancient symbols of her house recognized that their time was coming again. In her hands, she would soon hold 3 dragon eggs, gifts that seemed merely decorative but carried within them the potential to change the world itself. The exiled princess had survived poverty, abuse, and abandonment to reach this moment. But her greatest trials lay ahead. The girl who had learned to endure would soon discover that she possessed the strength not merely to survive, but to conquer, to liberate, and ultimately to transform both herself and the world around her. The storm that had marked her birth was nothing compared to the tempest she would unleash upon the world, for good and ill, in the years to come. The wedding ceremony that bound Daenerys Targaryen to Khal Drogo took place according to ancient Dothraki traditions, beneath the open sky where the horse lords believed their gods could witness all vows and judge their worth. The celebration proved as alien to the young Targaryen princess as everything else about her new life, filled with violence, bloodshed, and rituals that spoke to the fundamental differences between her noble upbringing and the warrior culture she was now expected to embrace. The Dothraki considered a wedding without at least 3 deaths to be a boring affair, and Drogo's wedding feast lived up to their expectations in spectacular fashion. Among the many gifts presented to the new Khaleesi, 3 artifacts would prove far more significant than anyone present could have imagined. Magister Illyrio, whose calculating mind worked toward purposes still hidden from view, presented Daenerys with 3 dragon eggs, said to have come from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. The fossilized remains were beautiful beyond description, their scales gleaming with deep jewel tones of green, cream, and black, but they appeared to be nothing more than decorative curiosities from a world where dragons had been extinct for over a century. The Magister claimed that the eggs had turned to stone with the passage of time, though he spoke these words with a strange smile that suggested hidden meanings. From Ser Jorah Mormont, an exiled knight of Westeros who had found himself in service to the Targaryen cause, Daenerys received books about the 7 kingdoms and the history of her ancestral home. The knight's offer of service to Viserys carried undertones that the prince was too obsessed with his own grievances to notice. But Daenerys sensed something different in the older man's demeanor. Unlike the calculating gazes she had grown accustomed to receiving, Jorah's attention seemed tinged with genuine respect, and perhaps something deeper that she could not yet identify. Khal Drogo's gift proved to be a magnificent white mare, a creature of such beauty and spirit that even the Dothraki, who lived and breathed horses, stopped to admire her. When Daenerys attempted to express gratitude in the common tongue, asking Jorah for the Dothraki word for thanks, she learned her first lesson about her new culture. The horse lords, Jorah explained, had no word for gratitude in their language, for they took what they needed and gave what they chose, without expectation of reciprocal kindness. This absence of courtesy, so fundamental to the way she had been raised, marked just the beginning of the cultural chasm she would need to bridge. The wedding night that followed proved to be every bit as traumatic as Daenerys had feared it might be. Despite Drogo's earlier examination suggesting some recognition of her humanity, the great Khal took his new bride with the same forceful dominance he applied to every aspect of his life. The conjugal act, performed without gentleness or consideration for her inexperience and fear, left Daenerys tearful and traumatized, understanding for the first time the full reality of what her brother had sold her into. The physical pain paled beside the emotional devastation of realizing that this violation would be repeated night after night for the rest of her life. As the Khalasar began its journey toward Vaez Dothrak, the Dothraki holy city where all Khaleesi were expected to make pilgrimage, Daenerys struggled to adapt to her new circumstances. The constant motion of travel, the unfamiliar diet of mare's milk and horse meat, and the alien customs of her husband's people left her feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Her brother Viserys, who had followed the Khalasar in expectation of receiving his promised army, proved to be no source of comfort, growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as Drogo's delay in fulfilling their bargain. Ser Jorah, observing the young Khaleesi's distress with growing concern, began to provide guidance that would prove crucial to her survival and eventual transformation. He taught her to eat the dried horse meat that would keep her strength up during the long journey. And more importantly, he began to educate her about Dothraki culture and the harsh realities of the world beyond the relative safety of Pentos. His conversations with Daenerys revealed not only his knowledge of both Westeros and Essos, but also a deeper understanding of the complexities of power and survival that her sheltered upbringing had never provided. During these early weeks of marriage, Daenerys found herself increasingly fascinated by the dragon eggs that had been her wedding gift. In the privacy of her tent, she would hold them and study their intricate patterns, finding comfort in their warmth and beauty during the darkest moments of her adjustment to Dothraki life. Her handmaidens, Irri and Jihikwi, who had been assigned to serve her, initially regarded these examinations with puzzlement, having never seen their new Khaleesi display interest in anything beyond her daily survival. The addition of Dorea to her service proved to be a turning point in Daenerys' adaptation to her circumstances. The former pleasure slave from Lys brought with her knowledge that the Dothraki women, raised in their warrior culture, could not provide. Dorea understood the arts of seduction and the subtle ways in which a woman might influence a man, even one as seemingly immovable as Khal Drogo. More importantly, she recognized that Daenerys' survival depended not just on enduring her husband's attentions, but on transforming herself from victim to participant in their relationship. Under Dorea's tutelage, Daenerys began to learn that intimacy could be more than mere submission to force. The Lysene woman taught her how to take initiative, how to use her own desires as well as her husband's, and how to transform the nightly violation into something approaching mutual pleasure. These lessons proved difficult and embarrassing for the young princess, raised as she had been with traditional notions of feminine modesty, but she recognized them as essential skills for her survival and eventual happiness. The transformation did not happen overnight, but gradually Daenerys began to notice changes in her relationship with Drogo. As she applied Dorea's teachings, taking a more active role in their intimate encounters, she observed that her husband began to treat her with something approaching respect. The brutal taking that had characterized their early nights together gave way to encounters where her comfort and pleasure became considerations rather than afterthoughts. More significantly, she began to see recognition in his dark eyes, acknowledgement that she was more than just another possession to be used at his whim. While Dorea taught her the arts of physical intimacy, Irri proved instrumental in helping Daenerys master the Dothraki language. The young handmaiden possessed patience and skill as a teacher, correcting Daenerys' pronunciation with gentle persistence and explaining the cultural contexts that gave meaning to the Horse Lord's words. Language proved to be the key that unlocked understanding between Daenerys and her new people, allowing her to move beyond the role of exotic ornament and begin to participate in the social structure of the Khalasar. As her command of Dothraki improved, Daenerys began to understand the conversations flowing around her and to recognize her own growing influence within the Khalasar. The warriors, who had initially viewed her as merely their Khal's newest acquisition, began to acknowledge her presence with something approaching deference. Her transformation from frightened girl to confident woman did not go unnoticed among people who valued strength and courage above all other virtues. This newfound confidence received its first major test during a rest stop in the Dothraki Sea, when Daenerys decided to explore a glade away from the main camp. The simple act of commanding the Khalasar to halt so that she might walk among the trees represented a dramatic assertion of authority that would have been unthinkable during her first weeks of marriage. When Viserys attempted to reassert his dominance over her, publicly berating her for giving orders to the Dothraki warriors, her response marked a definitive break from her past submissiveness. For the first time in her life, Daenerys stood up to her brother's violence and intimidation. When Viserys raised his hand to strike her, as he had done countless times before, she did not cower or flee. Instead, she struck back, using the heavy golden belt of her Dothraki clothing to deliver a blow that sent her brother reeling. The shock on Viserys' face as he stared at his sister matched that of the Dothraki warriors who witnessed this unprecedented display of defiance. In that moment, the last vestige of his control over her shattered completely. The confrontation established new boundaries in their relationship and demonstrated to the entire Khalasar that their Khaleesi possessed the strength of will that the Horse Lords respected above all other qualities. Rakharo and the other Blood Riders made it clear that they would protect Daenerys from any further attempts at violence by her brother, even going so far as to threaten to take his ear if he raised a hand to her again. Viserys found himself increasingly isolated within the Khalasar, viewed with suspicion and contempt by warriors who saw his treatment of their Khaleesi as cowardly and dishonorable. During this period of growing confidence and authority, Daenerys discovered that she was carrying Drogo's child. The pregnancy represented far more than a personal milestone, serving as validation of her position within Dothraki society and providing her with a new source of power and influence. When she announced the news to her husband, predicting with absolute certainty that the child would be a son, Drogo's joy and pride transformed their relationship completely. The Khal, who had taken her as a political necessity, now looked upon her as the mother of his heir and the future of his bloodline. The pregnancy also marked the beginning of deeper conversations between Daenerys and her handmaidens about the mysteries and legends surrounding dragons. During quiet evenings in her tent, as she held the fossilized dragon eggs that had been her wedding gift, Dorea would share stories from her homeland about the ancient days when 2 moons had hung in the sky. According to Lysene legend, one moon had wandered too close to the sun and cracked like an egg, releasing thousands of dragons into the world. Though Aerie and Jahiqui dismissed these tales as mere folklore, claiming that the moon was a goddess and wife to the sun, Daenerys found herself captivated by the possibility that dragons might someday return to the world. The journey to Vaes Dothrak, the holy city of the Dothraki, where no blood could be shed and all Khaleesi were expected to make pilgrimage, provided Daenerys with her first glimpse of the broader world beyond her brother's limited perspective. Ser Jorah, whose knowledge of both Westeros and Essos made him an invaluable advisor, began to educate her about the political realities that would face any attempt to reclaim the Iron Throne. He explained the challenges of persuading the Dothraki to cross the narrow sea, their fear of water that horses could not drink, and the tactical advantages that stone castles would provide to any enemies who chose to avoid open battle. Their conversations also revealed the exile's own tragic history. His marriage to a woman whose expensive tastes had driven him to sell poachers into slavery, ultimately leading to his disgrace and banishment from Westeros. Jorah's frank admission of his crimes and his current lonely existence struck a chord with Daenerys, who recognized in him another person displaced by circumstances beyond their control. His obvious intelligence and loyalty, combined with his growing devotion to her personally rather than to the abstract cause of Targaryen restoration, made him the first advisor she truly trusted. The arrival at Vaes Dothrak marked another significant milestone in Daenerys' transformation from exile to queen. The ancient city, built around the remnants of civilizations conquered by the Dothraki over countless generations, represented the accumulated power and history of the Horse Lords in stone and bronze. Here, among the monuments to their victories and the gathered wisdom of the Dosh Khaleen, the crones who advised all Khali, Daenerys would participate in ceremonies that would determine her unborn son's destiny and her own future role within Dothraki society. The ceremony of eating the raw heart of a stallion, performed before the assembled Dosh Khaleen as a test of the unborn child's strength, proved to be one of the most challenging trials Daenerys had yet faced. The bloody ritual required her to consume the entire organ without stopping or vomiting, demonstrating that her son would be strong enough to lead the Dothraki people. Despite her revulsion at the barbaric ceremony, Daenerys forced herself to complete the task, driven by her growing understanding that survival among the Horse Lords required embracing their customs completely rather than merely enduring them. Her successful completion of the ritual prompted a prophecy from the Dosh Khaleen that would echo through the rest of her life and beyond. The ancient women declared that her son would be the stallion who mounts the world, the great Khal who would unite all Dothraki Khalisars into a single mighty horde and lead them in conquest across all the lands of the earth. This prophecy elevated Daenerys' status within Dothraki society, while simultaneously placing enormous expectations upon her unborn child and, by extension, upon herself as his mother. During their time in Vaes Dothrak, Viserys' growing frustration with what he perceived as Drogo's failure to provide the promised army finally boiled over into actions that would prove to be his undoing. His attempt to steal the dragon eggs, which he planned to sell in order to raise his own force of sellswords, was thwarted by Ser Jorah, who had grown increasingly disgusted with the prince's behavior and his treatment of his sister. The confrontation between the two men revealed Viserys' complete inability to understand the dynamics of power and respect that governed the world he found himself in. The final break came during a feast in the sacred halls of Vaes Dothrak, when Viserys' patience with diplomatic niceties finally exhausted itself completely. Drawing his sword in the holy city where no weapons were permitted and no blood could be shed, he threatened to kill Daenerys and her unborn child unless Drogo immediately provided him with the crown and army he had been promised. The violation of sacred law, combined with the threat to a pregnant Khaleesi, marked Viserys as irredeemably dishonored in the eyes of every Dothraki present. Khal Drogo's response proved as swift as it was final. Declaring that Viserys would indeed receive a crown, the great Khal ordered his servants to melt down golden rings and medallions in a brazier. When the metal reached the proper temperature, Drogo poured the molten gold over Viserys' head, granting him the golden crown he had demanded while simultaneously ending his life in agony. The horrible death, watched by Daenerys with surprising composure, marked the end of her last connection to her old life and the final step in her transformation from victim to queen. As her brother died screaming, Daenerys observed with cold clarity that he was no true dragon, for fire could not kill a dragon. This statement, made with absolute conviction, revealed not only her complete emotional separation from Viserys, but also a growing awareness of her own unique nature. The same heat that had killed her brother was something she increasingly understood as connected to her very essence, a power that marked her as different from ordinary people and connected her to the ancient legacy of her Dragon Lord ancestors. With Viserys dead and her son prophesied to conquer the world, Daenerys attempted to convince Drogo that they should begin preparing for the invasion of Westeros that would place their child on the Iron Throne of his ancestors. However, the Khal remained reluctant to lead his people across the poisonous water, as the Dothraki called the sea, particularly since the original bargain had been with Viserys rather than with Daenerys herself. The Horse Lords' traditional fear of deep water and their preference for the endless grasslands they had always known made them poor candidates for overseas conquest, regardless of the promised rewards. This reluctance to fulfill what Daenerys saw as their destiny might have continued indefinitely. But events in the wider world intervened to change the course of their story. King Robert Baratheon, learning of Daenerys' pregnancy and the possibility that a new generation of Targaryens might one day challenge his rule, ordered her assassination. The attempt came in the form of a wine merchant who offered her a cask of wine from the arbor, claiming it was a gift from well-wishers in Westeros who hoped to see the true queen restored to her rightful throne. Ser Jorah's quick thinking and knowledge of poisons saved Daenerys' life when he recognized the merchant's suspicious behavior and forced him to drink from his own wine. The man's immediate death from the poisoned vintage revealed the true nature of Robert's gift and demonstrated to Drogo that enemies across the narrow sea were actively plotting against his wife and unborn son. This attempt on the life of his Khaleesi finally provided the Khal with the justification he needed to overcome his warriors' reluctance to cross water and fight in foreign lands. Enraged by this attack on his family, Drogo swore a great oath before his assembled khalasar. He would indeed lead the Dothraki across the narrow sea, he declared, and he would take the Iron Throne not as a gift to his wife's brother, but as vengeance for the attempt on her life. His warriors would rape the usurper's women, enslave his children, and pull down his stone houses. They would take Westeros with fire and blood, and his son would sit upon the throne that was rightfully his, by birth and conquest both. To finance this great expedition, Drogo led his khalasar on raids into the lands of Lazar, the peaceful shepherd people whom the Dothraki contemptuously called the Lamb Men. These attacks provided the wealth needed to purchase ships and supplies for the crossing, but they also exposed Daenerys to the harsh realities of Dothraki warfare and conquest. The brutal treatment of prisoners, particularly women and children, horrified her and led to the first serious conflicts between her moral convictions and her husband's cultural expectations. When Daenerys intervened to protect some of the Lazarene women from rape and murder, her actions were seen as inappropriate interference with the traditional rights of victorious warriors. Her confrontation with Mago, one of Drogo's bloodriders who resented her protection of the captives, forced the Khal to choose between his wife's humanitarian concerns and his followers' expectations of the spoils of war. The challenge resulted in single combat between Drogo and Mago, a fight that the Khal won easily but not without sustaining a wound across his chest. Among the women Daenerys saved was Mirri Maz Duur, a Lazarene godswife and healer who claimed knowledge of the healing arts learned in various cities across Essos. When Drogo's wound began to fester despite the primitive treatments applied by the Dothraki healers, Daenerys convinced her husband to accept Miri's offer of more sophisticated medical care. This decision, made from love and desperation, would prove to be one of the most consequential choices of her young life. As the wound worsened and Drogo's strength failed, he eventually fell from his horse during the march, an event that the Dothraki interpreted as a clear sign that their Khal was dying. In their culture, a Khal who could not ride was no Khal at all, and many of the warriors began to abandon the Khalasar to seek service with stronger leaders. Faced with the imminent death of her husband and the collapse of everything she had built, Daenerys made another desperate choice that would forever change her relationship with the supernatural forces that governed the world. She convinced Mirri Maz Duur to attempt a magical healing that might save Drogo's life, despite the God's Wife's warnings that such magic always demanded a terrible price. The blood magic ritual that followed required the sacrifice of Drogo's favorite stallion and contained elements that seemed to violate the natural order itself. As the ceremony proceeded, Daenerys went into premature labor, and in the chaos that followed, she was taken into the tent where the dark magic was being performed, against the explicit warnings she had received. The price of attempting to cheat death proved to be higher than Daenerys could have imagined. Her son Rhaego, named for her dead brother Rhaegar, was stillborn and horrifically deformed, his body covered in scales and possessed of features that seemed more reptilian than human. Drogo himself survived the magical healing, but only in body. His mind and soul departed, leaving behind a living husk that could not speak, move, or recognize the wife who had sacrificed everything to save him. Mirri Maz Duur revealed that this outcome had been her intention all along: revenge for the destruction of her temple and the rape and murder of her people. She had deliberately corrupted the healing magic, using Daenerys' desperation against her and extracting a price that went far beyond anything that had been agreed upon. The loss of her child and the reduction of her husband to a mindless shell represented not just personal tragedy, but the complete collapse of all her hopes and plans for the future. Faced with the impossible choice between allowing Drogo to exist in his vegetative state or ending his suffering, Daenerys chose mercy over hope. In the privacy of their tent, she smothered him with a pillow, whispering words of love and gratitude as she released him from a life that was no longer truly life. This act of euthanasia, performed out of love rather than malice, marked the final transformation of the girl who had once been too frightened to stand up to her brother's abuse into a woman capable of making the hardest choices life could demand. The funeral pyre that Daenerys constructed for her husband represented more than simple mourning for the dead. It became the culmination of her transformation and the beginning of something entirely new in the world. She placed her 3 dragon eggs among the flames, along with Mirri Maz Duur, who would burn as punishment for her betrayal and as payment for the magic she had performed. As the fire grew and the assembled Dothraki expected their former Khaleesi to collapse in grief, Daenerys instead delivered a speech that would echo through history. She told the remaining members of the Khalasar that they were free to leave and seek service with other Khals, but that those who stayed with her would be part of something greater than any conquest the Dothraki had ever imagined. Then, as the funeral pyre reached its full intensity, she walked directly into the flames, trusting in her growing certainty that fire could not harm a true dragon. The heat that had marked her throughout her life, the affinity for warmth that had always set her apart, finally revealed its true significance as the dragon fire washed over her without causing harm. When dawn broke over the Dothraki Sea, the impossible had occurred. Daenerys emerged from the cooling ashes naked but unburnt, her hair and clothing consumed by flames that had left no mark upon her skin. Clinging to her body were 3 newly hatched dragons, the first to exist in the world for over a century and a half. The creatures that had been thought extinct since the death of the last dragons in King's Landing were now reborn, bonded to the woman who had walked through fire to give them life. The sight of their former Khaleesi standing unharmed in the ashes, cradling living dragons as she had once cradled fossilized eggs, shattered every assumption the Dothraki had held about the natural world. Jorah Mormont, the first to approach, knelt in recognition of the miracle he had witnessed, followed by every remaining member of the Khalasar. They had followed a Khal and his foreign wife into the grasslands, but they now knelt before the Mother of Dragons, a figure of myth made flesh, a queen who commanded powers that defied all understanding. The frightened girl who had been sold into marriage to save her brother's pride had died in that fire along with Khal Drogo and her unborn son. What emerged from the flames was something new. A woman who had touched magic itself and been reborn in ways that would reshape the world. The true journey of Daenerys Stormborn, the mother of dragons, the breaker of chains, was only beginning, but already the old world trembled at the implications of her transformation. The birth of dragons marked the beginning of a new age. But it also brought challenges that no living person possessed the knowledge to address. Daenerys found herself the mother of 3 creatures that had not existed in the world for over a century. With no guidance save instinct and the fragmented legends preserved in old books. The dragons themselves, though magnificent and magical, were still infants, no larger than house cats, and their needs proved as mysterious as their existence was miraculous. She named them for the men she had lost, Drogon for her husband, Rhaegal for her brother Rhaegar, and Viserion even for the brother who had tormented her, understanding that hatred was itself a form of remembrance. The remnants of Drogo's Khalasar, reduced to perhaps 100 souls by the disasters that had befallen their Khal, now found themselves following a queen unlike any the world had seen before. These survivors, bound to Daenerys by the miracle they had witnessed and the loyalty they felt toward one who had shared their sufferings, faced an uncertain future in the vast Dothraki Sea. The grasslands that had sustained their people for countless generations now seemed empty and hostile, offering no clear path forward for those who served a Khaleesi without a Khal. Water became their first and most immediate concern as they departed from the site of Drogo's funeral pyre. The arid landscape of the Red Waste stretched before them, a desolate expanse that had claimed the lives of countless travelers foolish enough to attempt its crossing without adequate preparation. Daenerys made the difficult decision to lead her people into this wasteland, understanding that remaining in the Dothraki Sea would mean eventual starvation or absorption into other Khalasars that might not welcome Drogo's former followers. The journey across the Red Waste proved to be a trial that tested every member of their small company to the limits of human endurance. The relentless sun beat down upon them during the day, while the temperature plummeted at night, creating conditions that sapped strength and morale with each passing hour. Their water supplies, carefully rationed though they were, dwindled at an alarming rate, and the horses that represented both transportation and emergency food began to succumb to the harsh conditions. Daenerys discovered during these desperate weeks that her dragons, despite their magical nature, required constant care and attention to survive. They refused the raw meat she initially offered them, forcing her to experiment with different approaches to feeding. She learned through trial and error that they preferred their food cooked, though their own fire-breathing abilities were still too weak and inconsistent to be relied upon for this purpose. The sight of their mother attempting to light fires for their meals became a daily ritual that both amazed and comforted the surviving Dothraki. The death of Daenerys' beloved silver mare, the wedding gift from Drogo that had carried her across half of Essos, marked one of the lowest points of their journey. The horse that had represented her first taste of freedom and power among the Dothraki finally succumbed to exhaustion and dehydration, leaving behind not just the loss of a faithful companion, but also the practical problem of how to continue their travels. The decision to send out scouts in different directions represented their last hope of finding salvation before their remaining supplies ran out completely. Rakaro, Ago, and Kovaro, the 3 blood riders who had remained loyal to Daenerys after their Khal's death, volunteered for this dangerous mission despite understanding that it likely meant death for at least some of them. Each man rode out in a different direction, carrying with him the hopes of their entire company and the knowledge that failure would doom everyone they left behind. The wait for their return proved agonizing, as days passed without any sign of success or even survival. The discovery of Rakaro's headless corpse, his long braids severed as a trophy by unknown enemies, brought grief and horror to the already desperate company. Jorah's examination of the remains revealed that the young blood rider had been caught and killed by a rival Khalasar, his mutilation ensuring that he could not enter the Nightlands with honor. Irie's devastation at the loss of the man she had loved provided a stark reminder of the human cost of their journey and the reality that their small numbers made them vulnerable to any group of hostile riders. Daenerys honored Rakaro's memory with a funeral ceremony that adapted Dothraki traditions to their current circumstances, burning his body despite the scarcity of fuel and speaking words of remembrance that acknowledged both his service and his sacrifice. The ritual provided some comfort to his mourners, while also serving as a defiant statement that they would maintain their customs and dignity, even in the face of approaching death. The flames that consumed Rakaro's remains seemed to dance higher than they should have, as if the dragon's presence somehow amplified the fire's intensity. When Kovaro finally returned with news of a great city that would accept them, the relief felt by the entire company bordered on religious ecstasy. The Blood Rider brought word of Qarth, the greatest of the trading cities, where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods and information. More importantly, he carried an invitation from the city's rulers, though the terms of their welcome remained unclear and potentially dangerous for a group as small and vulnerable as Daenerys' followers. The approach to Qarth revealed a city unlike anything Daenerys had encountered in her travels across Essos. The walls that surrounded it rose higher than any she had seen, decorated with intricate carvings that spoke to the wealth and sophistication of its inhabitants. The gardens that lay beyond those walls promised water and shade, luxuries that seemed almost mythical after the deprivations of the Red Waste. Yet the very grandeur of the city made their own poverty and desperation more apparent, highlighting the vast gulf between their circumstances and those of the people whose mercy they now sought. The reception they received from the 13, the ruling council of Qarth, proved initially disappointing and potentially catastrophic. The merchant princes who governed the city showed little interest in the survival of a few dozen desert refugees, regardless of the titles their leader might claim. Their demand to see the dragons before granting entry to the city created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to end their journey at the very gates of salvation. Daenerys' refusal to display her children like trained animals demonstrated both her growing political sophistication and her protective instincts as a mother. The intervention of Xaro Exo-Andaxos, one of the most prominent members of the 13, provided the breakthrough that saved them from death in the desert. His decision to vouch for their entry into the city, made against the objections of his fellow council members, came at significant political cost to himself and established a debt that would complicate their relationship throughout their stay. The merchant prince's motives remained opaque, hidden behind layers of courtly courtesy and business calculation that made it impossible to determine whether he acted from genuine kindness or shrewd investment in future possibilities. Life within the walls of Qarth provided Daenerys with her first opportunity since Drogo's death to rest, recover, and plan for the future. Xaro's palace offered luxuries that seemed almost decadent after their recent privations, with gardens, fountains, and servants attending to every need. The abundance of food and water allowed both the dragons and their human companions to regain strength, while providing time for Daenerys to consider her long-term objectives and the challenges that lay ahead. The dragons themselves began to show more personality and individual characteristics during this period of recovery and growth. Drogon, named for her late husband, proved to be the largest and most aggressive of the three, with scales as black as night and eyes that burned with inner fire. Rhaegal, bearing her brother's name, displayed green coloring that reminded observers of the forests of the Summer Isles, while Viserion's cream and gold scales seemed to catch and reflect light in ways that made him appear almost ethereal. Each dragon responded differently to training and showed distinct preferences in food and behavior. During their stay in Qarth, Daenerys began the delicate process of teaching her dragons to breathe fire on command, a skill that would prove essential to their survival and her own political ambitions. The training proved frustrating and dangerous, as the young dragons' control over their abilities remained inconsistent and unpredictable. Small successes, such as Drogon successfully cooking a piece of meat at her direction, felt like major victories and provided hope that greater achievements might be possible in time. The political landscape of Qarth presented both opportunities and dangers for a young queen seeking to rebuild her power base. The city's wealth came from its position at the center of trade routes connecting east and west, making it a natural place to gather information about events across the known world. However, this same centrality meant that news of the dragon's existence would spread quickly to every corner of Essos and beyond, potentially attracting unwanted attention from those who might view them as threats or prizes to be captured. Xaro's courtship of Daenerys, couched in terms of political alliance and mutual benefit, represented one possible path forward, but one fraught with complications and compromises. His proposal of marriage, accompanied by promises of ships and gold sufficient to reclaim her birthright, forced her to weigh practical necessities against personal autonomy and the lessons she had learned about the costs of entering into relationships based on convenience rather than choice. The merchant prince's obvious wealth and power made his offer tempting, but his calculating nature and hidden motives raised questions about what such an alliance might ultimately cost her. The arrival of disturbing news from Westeros added urgency to these considerations and reminded Daenerys that events beyond her control continued to shape the political landscape she hoped one day to influence. Reports of King Robert Baratheon's death in a hunting accident, followed by the outbreak of civil war between various claimants to the Iron Throne, suggested that the stability of the usurper's regime was crumbling. Yet this apparent opportunity came with its own dangers, as multiple factions now competed for power, making it unclear which side a returning Targaryen might support or oppose. Ser Jorah's counsel during this period proved invaluable in helping Daenerys navigate both the immediate challenges of life in Qarth and the broader strategic questions raised by events in Westeros. His knowledge of the major houses and their likely allegiances provided context for understanding the Civil War's probable course, while his growing understanding of Eastern politics helped her avoid potential pitfalls in dealing with the Qartheen. More importantly, his obvious devotion to her personally rather than to abstract political goals gave her someone she could trust completely in a city full of merchants and schemers. The discussions between Daenerys and Jorah about her future plans revealed the depth of his feelings for her and the complexity of their relationship. His suggestion that she might be better served by consolidating power in Essos rather than rushing back to claim a throne surrounded by enemies demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his desire to keep her safe from the dangers that awaited in Westeros. These conversations also highlighted the growing tension between her desire for the Iron Throne and the responsibilities she felt toward the people who had chosen to follow her into exile. The introduction of Pyat Pree and the Warlocks of Qarth added a supernatural dimension to the political maneuvering that surrounded Daenerys during her stay in the city. The demonstration of magical powers that the Warlock performed, creating multiple versions of himself through sorcery, suggested that the dragon's presence had awakened forces that had long lain dormant. His invitation to visit the House of the Undying, coupled with claims that the dragons had restored magic to a world that had nearly forgotten it, raised questions about the true nature of her children and the role they might play in events yet to come. The growing influence of the Warlocks, combined with Xaro's increasingly insistent marriage proposals, created a web of competing interests that threatened to trap Daenerys in Qarth indefinitely. Each faction that sought to use her for their own purposes offered immediate benefits while demanding concessions that would limit her freedom and compromise her long-term goals. The realization that she was becoming more valuable to her hosts as a permanent resident than as a temporary guest forced her to confront the possibility that their hospitality might become a prison if she did not act decisively. The decision to attempt negotiations with other members of Qarth's ruling class, seeking alternatives to Xaro's proposals, and the Warlock's increasingly urgent invitations led to a series of disappointments that highlighted the limited nature of her options. The Spice King and other merchant princes made it clear that they viewed her as an interesting curiosity rather than a serious political player, offering only token assistance while making demands that would have reduced her to little more than a decorative figurehead in their own schemes for profit and advancement. These rejections, while painful to her pride, served an important purpose in clarifying the true nature of the choices before her. The merchants of Qarth, for all their wealth and sophistication, thought in terms of immediate profit and personal advantage, rather than the grand sweep of history and justice that motivated her own ambitions. Their inability to see beyond the immediate risks of supporting her cause revealed the fundamental differences in vision and values that separated her from the commercial culture of the great trading city. The crisis that would ultimately force her departure from Qarth came not from political maneuvering or diplomatic failure, but from direct attack by enemies who had grown tired of subtlety and negotiation. The massacre of half her remaining followers, including the faithful Eyrie, served as a brutal reminder that safety was an illusion for someone in her position. The capture of her dragons, the living symbols of her power, and the source of whatever leverage she possessed in dealing with her hosts, represented a catastrophe that threatened to end her story before it could truly begin. The discovery that Dorea, the woman who had taught her the arts that had won Drogo's love and respect, had betrayed her to the Warlocks, and Xaro represented a personal betrayal that cut deeper than political setbacks or military defeats. The realization that someone she had trusted and cared for had sold her out for promises of wealth and position forced Daenerys to confront the harsh realities of leadership and the isolation that came with power. Trust, she learned, was a luxury that queens could ill afford, and loyalty was a rarer commodity than gold or dragons. The rescue of her dragons from the House of the Undying would require her to face supernatural dangers that tested not only her courage, but also her growing understanding of her own unique nature and abilities. The journey into the heart of Warlock power, guided only by her determination to reclaim her children and her faith in the bond between them, marked another crucial step in her transformation from exile seeking restoration to a force of change that would reshape the world around her. The confrontation at the House of the Undying revealed truths about Daenerys' destiny that would shape every decision she made in the years to come. Within the ancient structure where the Warlocks of Qarth had practiced their arts for countless generations, she experienced visions that transcended simple prophecy, offering glimpses of possible futures and paths not taken. The sight of snow falling in the ruined throne room of the Red Keep, the Iron Throne tantalizingly close yet somehow out of reach, suggested that her journey to reclaim her birthright would prove far more complex and costly than she had imagined. The vision of Drogo and their son Rhaego, alive and whole in a tent beyond the wall, provided both comfort and torment in equal measure. Here was the life she might have lived, the happiness that blood magic and betrayal had stolen from her. Yet she understood even in that moment of reunion that it was merely an illusion designed to trap her in the Warlock's web. Her ability to turn away from this perfect dream, choosing harsh reality over comforting fantasy, demonstrated the strength of will that would carry her through the trials ahead. The destruction of Pyat Pri and his fellow Warlocks through Dragonfire marked the first time Daenerys had used her children as weapons of war, a precedent that would echo through every battle she would fight thereafter. The simple command Dracarys became more than just a word in High Valyrian. It became a promise of judgment and a tool of justice that she would wield against all who threatened the innocent or stood in the way of her vision of a better world. The flames that consumed the Warlocks served notice to all who witnessed them that the Age of Dragons had truly returned. Her confrontation with Xaro Exhoan Daxos in the aftermath of her escape revealed both the merchant prince's true character and her own growing political sophistication. The discovery that his legendary vault contained nothing but empty air provided a valuable lesson about the difference between reputation and reality, between the appearance of wealth and its substance. His betrayal, though painful, served to harden her resolve and teach her that trust must be earned through actions rather than words. The decision to lock Xaro and Dorea in the empty vault to die demonstrated a ruthlessness that would have been unthinkable in the frightened girl who had cowered before Viserys' rages. Yet this harsh justice felt entirely natural to the woman who had walked through fire and emerged with dragons, a necessary response to betrayal that protected both her remaining followers and her future ambitions. The lesson was clear to all who served her. Loyalty would be rewarded, but treachery would be met with death. The wealth salvaged from Xaro's palace, combined with the knowledge gained from their experiences in Qarth, provided Daenerys with the resources needed to continue her journey and the wisdom to use those resources more effectively. The ship that carried them away from the city sailed toward destinations that promised greater challenges, but also greater opportunities for someone willing to embrace the role of liberator rather than merely conqueror. The course she set would take them not toward Westeros and the Iron Throne, but deeper into Essos and confrontation with institutions that had oppressed the weak for thousands of years. The arrival in Astapor marked the beginning of Daenerys' transformation from refugee queen to active force for social change. The great city of Slavers Bay, built upon the systematic brutalization of human beings for profit, represented everything she had come to despise about the world she sought to rule. Here, children were stolen from their families, castrated, and trained as emotionless killing machines, their humanity stripped away in service to masters who viewed them as livestock rather than people. Her first encounter with the Unsullied in their training barracks provided a stark introduction to the realities of institutional slavery on a scale beyond anything she had previously witnessed. Krasnis Mo Naklos, the slave master who owned 8,000 of these warrior eunuchs, made no effort to hide the brutal methods used to create them. His casual demonstration of their conditioning, slicing off a soldier's nipple to prove their immunity to pain, horrified Daenerys while simultaneously revealing the depth of control that years of abuse could achieve. The translator, Missandei, a young woman whose intelligence and dignity had somehow survived the systematic dehumanization of slavery, provided Daenerys with insights into both the Unsullied's creation and their potential for something greater. Through their conversations, conducted in multiple languages that showcased the girl's remarkable education, Daenerys began to understand that the slaves of Slavers Bay possessed abilities and knowledge that their masters either ignored or actively suppressed. The waste of human potential, represented by the slave system, offended her sense of justice as much as its cruelty. Krasnis's assumption that Daenerys could not understand High Valyrian provided her with a crucial advantage in the negotiations that would determine the fate of thousands of lives. His constant insults and derogatory comments, delivered in the ancient language while Missandei provided sanitized translations, revealed the contempt with which he viewed both her and all women in positions of authority. This underestimation would prove to be a fatal error, allowing Daenerys to plan her response while maintaining the appearance of naive compliance with his demands. The decision to offer Drogon in exchange for all 8,000 Unsullied, plus those still in training, represented the most difficult choice Daenerys had made since walking into Drogo's funeral pyre. The dragons were more than weapons or symbols of power. They were her children. And the thought of trading one of them for an army struck at the very core of her maternal instincts. Yet she understood that the liberation of Slavers Bay would require military force beyond what her small company could provide. And the Unsullied represented the finest soldiers in the known world. Ser Jorah and Ser Barristan's objections to the proposed trade reflected both their loyalty to her and their understanding of the dragon's importance to her long-term prospects for reclaiming Westeros. Their arguments about the impossibility of conquering the Seven Kingdoms without dragons carried weight, but they failed to account for the moral imperative that now drove her decisions. The suffering of the enslaved thousands outweighed even her own dynastic ambitions, marking a fundamental shift in her priorities that would define the rest of her reign. The revelation that Missandei understood High Valyrian, despite having concealed this knowledge throughout their negotiations, provided another lesson about the hidden depths that existed within those whom society had dismissed as powerless. The girl's quiet assertion that we are not men when discussing the ancient phrase Valar Morghulis suggested possibilities for alliance and understanding that transcended the simple categories of master, slave, conqueror, and conquered. The day of the exchange outside Astapor's walls brought together all the elements that would define Daenerys' approach to liberation and conquest for years to come. The presence of 8,000 Unsullied in perfect formation demonstrated the military might she was gaining, while Krasnis's obvious hostility toward Drogon revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about the true nature of the bargain they had struck. The golden whip that symbolized ownership of the Unsullied felt strange in her hands, an artifact of oppression that she intended to transform into an instrument of freedom. The moment of revelation, when Daenerys spoke to the Unsullied in perfect High Valyrian and revealed her understanding of every insult Krasnis had delivered. represented more than simple political theater. Her command that the Unsullied kill all the masters while sparing the innocent demonstrated both her commitment to justice and her understanding of the surgical precision that true liberation required. The slaves who had been brutalized and oppressed would be freed, but those who profited from their suffering would face the consequences of their choices. Drogon's execution of Krasnus, carried out at Daenerys' command with the single word Dracarys, served as both personal vengeance and public demonstration of the new order that was dawning. The fire that consumed the slave master also consumed the old certainties about power and its exercise, announcing to all who witnessed it that the age of accepting injustice as natural law had ended. The dragon's flames proclaimed that those who built their fortunes on the suffering of others would no longer be protected by tradition or law. The aftermath of Astapor's fall provided Daenerys with her first opportunity to test the principles she claimed to champion. Her address to the newly freed Unsullied, offering them the choice between departure and continued service, represented a radical departure from the coercion that had defined their entire existence. The soldiers who had been conditioned never to question orders now faced the unprecedented challenge of making their own decisions about their futures. The moment of silence that greeted her offer of freedom highlighted the profound difficulty of transitioning from slavery to liberty after years of systematic dehumanization. These men had been trained from childhood to exist without personal desires or individual identity, making the sudden gift of choice as bewildering as it was welcome. When one soldier finally began to beat his spear against the ground in acceptance of her leadership, followed by all the others, it marked not just political victory but human triumph over the forces that had sought to destroy their very souls. The election of Grey Worm as commander of the Unsullied, chosen by the soldiers themselves rather than imposed from above, demonstrated Daenerys' commitment to allowing those she liberated to shape their own destinies. His decision to keep the name that had been given to him as a slave, because it was the name he bore when Daenerys Stormborn set him free, revealed both the complexity of identity after oppression and the profound impact that genuine liberation could have on human dignity. The march toward Yunkai provided time for Daenerys to consolidate her victory and plan for the challenges ahead. The sight of her dragons flying overhead, while 8,000 Unsullied marched in perfect formation below, created a spectacle that announced the arrival of a new power in Essos. Yet she understood that military might alone would not be sufficient to achieve the lasting change she envisioned, and the political complexities of governing liberated territories would prove as challenging as the conquest itself. Her encounter with the Yunkai herald Razdal Moeraz revealed the sophisticated resistance she could expect from the established order of Slavers Bay. His attempts to bribe her with gold and ships, coupled with threats about Yunkai's powerful friends, demonstrated that the slave masters understood the existential threat she represented to their entire way of life. Their willingness to fight rather than accept the end of slavery showed that liberation would require sustained military pressure rather than simple intimidation. The discovery that Yunkai's powerful friends included the Second Sons, a professional mercenary company, highlighted one of the central challenges facing any revolutionary movement. Those who profited from the current system would always find others willing to defend it for pay, creating layers of resistance that went beyond simple ideological opposition. The mercenaries who fought to preserve slavery might not believe in its righteousness, but their economic interests aligned them with those who did. The meeting with the Second Sons captains Mero and Prendal Nagezn exposed Daenerys to the casual misogyny and crude opportunism that characterized much of the sellsword world. Their dismissive attitude toward her claims and their obvious contempt for her gender revealed assumptions about power that she would need to shatter before she could achieve her larger goals. Yet, these same attitudes also created opportunities for those willing to look beyond surface appearances and conventional wisdom. Daario Naharis's decision to betray his fellow captains and bring their severed heads as proof of his loyalty represented both personal opportunity and political calculation. His recognition that Daenerys offered something more valuable than mere employment, whether that was ideology, adventure, or simply the chance to serve someone whose cause transcended personal profit, marked him as different from the typical sellsword. His dramatic entrance into her bath chamber, heads in hand, provided a memorable introduction to someone who would play a significant role in both her military campaigns and her personal life. The assault on Yunkai through the city's weakly defended rear gate demonstrated the tactical advantages that could be gained through careful intelligence gathering and unconventional approaches. Daario's knowledge of the city's vulnerabilities, combined with Grey Worm's disciplined, unsullied, and Jorah's strategic guidance, created a combined force capable of achievements that none could have accomplished alone. The relatively quick fall of the city showed that superior training and motivation could overcome larger numbers when properly applied. The liberation of Yunkai provided Daenerys with her first taste of the adulation that would follow her throughout Slaver's Bay. The sight of thousands of former slaves emerging from the city to hail her as Mysa, their mother and liberator, offered emotional rewards that far exceeded any material wealth or political advantage. These moments of connection with those she had freed reminded her why the campaign was worth the costs it demanded and the risks it created. Yet even in triumph, complications emerged that would shadow her future efforts at liberation and governance. The logistics of caring for hundreds of thousands of newly freed slaves, the economic disruption caused by the sudden end of established trading relationships, and the resistance of those whose interests had been damaged by her interventions all created problems that military victory alone could not solve. The cheering crowds who celebrated her arrival would soon need food, shelter, employment, and protection, responsibilities that would test her abilities as thoroughly as any battle. The march toward Meereen, the greatest and most powerful of the slaving cities, represented both the culmination of her campaign in Slaver's Bay and the greatest challenge she had yet faced. Intelligence reports suggested that the masters of Meereen had learned from the fate of their neighbors and were preparing more sophisticated resistance than anything she had previously encountered. The presence of crucified slave children along the road to the city, 163 victims displayed as a deliberate provocation, demonstrated the depths of cruelty that the masters would embrace rather than accept the end of their dominance. Daenerys' insistence on looking upon each crucified child, on acknowledging their individual humanity rather than treating them as mere statistics of war, revealed both her moral strength and the psychological toll that leadership in such circumstances demanded. Each face she studied, each small body she ordered buried with dignity, added to the weight of responsibility she carried and the determination that drove her forward. The collars removed from their necks served as tangible reminders of the system she fought to destroy. The siege of Meereen began with a traditional challenge to single combat, offering Daenerys the opportunity to demonstrate both her tactical flexibility and her confidence in those who served her. Daario's quick dispatch of the Meereenese champion served multiple purposes beyond simple military advantage, showing the city's defenders that she commanded warriors of exceptional skill, while providing a stage for the psychological warfare that would prove as important as physical force in the conquest that followed. The decision to catapult the broken chains of previously freed slaves over Meereen's walls created a powerful symbol that spoke directly to those still enslaved within the city. The sight of shackles that had once bound human beings but now lay shattered and useless carried a message more potent than any speech or proclamation could have delivered. The demonstration that liberation was possible, that the chains which seemed so permanent could indeed be broken, planted seeds of hope and rebellion that would grow in the darkness of the master's oppression. Grey Worm's infiltration of the city and the slave revolt that followed represented the ultimate validation of Daenerys' approach to conquest and liberation. Rather than simply imposing freedom from without through military force, she had inspired those within Meereen to claim their own liberty and strike their own blows against their oppressors. The slaves who rose up against their masters and opened the gates to her army had become active participants in their own liberation rather than passive recipients of her benevolence. The entry into Meereen as liberator, surrounded by thousands of freed slaves shouting Mysa and throwing their broken collars at her feet, provided another moment of transcendent connection between Daenerys and those she had chosen to champion. Yet even as she savored the triumph and the joy of those she had freed, she understood that the hardest work lay ahead. Conquest had proven simpler than governance, and liberation easier than the construction of just institutions that could preserve and protect the freedom that had been won through blood and fire. The decision to remain in Meereen rather than sail immediately for Westeros marked a fundamental shift in Daenerys' priorities and understanding of true leadership. The reports from Yunkai and Astapor revealed the devastating consequences of liberation without sustained governance. As former masters reasserted control, and new tyrants emerged to fill the power vacuum left by her departure. In Yunkai, the wise masters had returned to reimpose slavery with renewed brutality, while Astapor had fallen under the control of a butcher named Cleon, who declared himself emperor and ruled through terror and arbitrary violence. These failures taught Daenerys that conquest meant nothing without the patient work of building institutions capable of preserving justice long after the conqueror had departed. The realization that she had freed hundreds of thousands of people, only to abandon them to new forms of oppression, weighed heavily upon her conscience and forced her to confront the difference between the dramatic gestures of war and the sustained commitment that peace required. The decision to remain in Meereen, to learn the difficult art of ruling rather than simply conquering, represented a maturation that would prove as challenging as any battle she had fought. The establishment of regular audiences for petitioners provided Daenerys with daily reminders of the complexity that governance brought to even simple questions of justice and mercy. Each person who approached the throne in Meereen's Great Pyramid brought not just individual grievances, but representative examples of the broader challenges facing any society attempting to transform itself from slavery to freedom. The cases that came before her revealed layers of complication that military solutions could never address, and moral ambiguities that defied easy resolution. The Gothard, whose flock had been destroyed by dragonfire, presented one of the earliest and most poignant examples of how her methods of liberation created new forms of injustice. The man had committed no crime beyond the misfortune of grazing his animals in a place where Drogon had chosen to hunt, yet his livelihood had been destroyed by the very creatures that symbolized her commitment to protecting the innocent. Her decision to compensate him threefold for his losses established a precedent that acknowledged her responsibility for the consequences of her power, even when those consequences had been unintended. The petition of Hisdar zo Lorak to bury his father created an even more complex moral challenge that highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between justice and vengeance in the aftermath of systematic oppression. The elder zo Lorak had been one of the 163 great masters crucified in retaliation for the murdered slave children. Yet his son's testimony revealed that he had opposed that atrocity and argued for mercy toward the innocent. The realization that her justice had claimed the life of one who had tried to prevent the very crime she sought to punish forced Daenerys to confront the imperfect nature of all human judgment. Her decision to allow the burial, made after careful consideration of Hisdar's arguments and evidence of his father's character, demonstrated both her commitment to fairness and her willingness to acknowledge mistakes. Yet the choice also revealed the impossible position she occupied as judge of crimes committed in a system she had never fully understood. The complexities of Meereenese society, with its intricate web of relationships and historical grievances, could not be easily parsed by someone whose knowledge came primarily from the perspective of those who had suffered most under the old order. The daily reality of governance brought other challenges that had never been addressed in the songs and stories that celebrated great conquests. The 200 additional petitioners waiting outside the throne room after she had heard only 2 cases provided a sobering reminder of the scope of need and grievance that freedom had unleashed. Each person seeking audience represented not just individual problems, but categories of issues that required systematic solutions rather than case-by-case adjudication. The growing insurgency of the Sons of the Harpy added a dimension of violent resistance to the political challenges facing Daenerys' rule in Meereen. The masked killers who struck at her supporters and freed slaves represented more than simple terrorism. They embodied the determination of the old order to reclaim power through any means necessary. Their attacks on unsullied patrols and freedmen who had embraced their liberation served both tactical and psychological purposes, demonstrating that the former masters retained the capability to strike back while creating an atmosphere of fear that undermined confidence in the new regime. The murder of White Rat, an unsullied who had chosen to visit a brothel despite his physical incapacity for conventional pleasure, illustrated the personal dimensions of the larger political struggle. His desire to experience some form of intimacy, to be held and treated with gentleness rather than simply obeyed as a weapon of war, spoke to the humanity that slavery had attempted to suppress but never fully destroyed. His death at the hands of the Sons of the Harpy transformed a deeply personal moment of vulnerability into a political statement about the price of embracing freedom. Daenerys' response to this murder, ordering that White Rat be buried with full honors in the Temple of the Graces, despite Myrrhines customs that would have denied him such dignity, demonstrated her commitment to honoring the humanity of all those who served her cause. The ceremony became both memorial and manifesto, a declaration that the old hierarchies that had denied worth to slaves and eunuchs no longer held power in her city. Yet even this gesture of respect became a source of controversy and resistance from those who viewed it as desecration of sacred spaces. The capture of a son of the Harpy provided an opportunity to test the principles of justice that Daenerys claimed to uphold, but it also revealed the tensions between different concepts of fairness and mercy. Sir Barristan's insistence that the captured killer deserved a fair trial reflected the traditions of Westerosi justice that emphasized due process and the presumption of innocence. Massador's demand for immediate execution represented the perspective of those who had suffered under the old system and viewed legal niceties as obstacles to necessary vengeance. The conflict between these viewpoints forced Daenerys to choose between competing definitions of justice while under pressure from advisors whose loyalty she valued, but whose counsel contradicted each other completely. Barristan's warnings about the dangers of arbitrary execution, supported by historical examples of how such practices had corrupted her father's reign, carried weight precisely because they came from someone who had witnessed the Mad King's descent into tyranny. Massador's arguments for swift punishment reflected the understandable desire of the oppressed to see their oppressors face consequences without delay or legal protection. Her decision to promise a fair trial, made after private consultation with Barristan about her father's crimes and their consequences, represented an attempt to establish the rule of law as something more than the arbitrary will of the ruler. Yet this commitment to due process created new problems when Massador, frustrated by what he saw as excessive mercy toward enemies of freedom, took justice into his own hands and executed the prisoner himself. The former slave's action placed Daenerys in an impossible position, where any response would alienate supporters whose loyalty she needed to maintain stability. The public execution of Massador, carried out despite her personal sympathy for his motivations and her understanding of the injustices that had driven his actions, demonstrated the terrible isolation that comes with ultimate authority. Her explanation to the assembled crowd that law must apply equally to all, that justice could not exist without consistency and fairness, represented principles that were easier to proclaim than to implement in a city torn between competing visions of right and wrong. The riots that followed showed how quickly attempts at even-handedness could be interpreted as betrayal by those whose support had made her victories possible. The return of Drogon during these troubles provided both comfort and reminder of the power that ultimately undergirded her authority in Meereen. Her largest dragon's appearance on the Great Pyramid as she stood alone and besieged by the consequences of difficult choices served as a visible symbol of the forces she commanded. Yet her inability to touch him, his flight away when she reached out in desperate need of connection and reassurance, highlighted the growing distance between herself and the creatures that had once seemed extensions of her own will and desire. This separation from her dragons reflected broader changes in Daenerys herself, as the responsibilities of rule transformed her from the impulsive liberator who had freed Slaver's Bay into a more cautious and calculating leader who understood the weight of every decision. The spontaneous actions that had characterized her earlier triumphs gave way to careful consideration of consequences and consultation with advisors whose experience might help her avoid the mistakes that had destroyed previous rulers. Yet this evolution toward mature leadership came at the cost of the passionate certainty that had once made her decisions feel effortless and right. The relationship with Daario Naharis that developed during this period provided both personal satisfaction and political complications that illustrated the challenges of maintaining private relationships while bearing public responsibilities. His presence in her private quarters, uninvited and presumptuous, reflected both his confidence in their connection and his fundamental misunderstanding of the distance that power created between ruler and subject. Their physical relationship, while providing emotional and sensual satisfaction that had been absent from her life since Drogo's death, also created vulnerabilities and distractions that her enemies might exploit. Daario's frustration with the constraints of peacekeeping duties, his preference for the clarity and excitement of combat over the tedious work of maintaining order, reflected the difficulties that many of her followers experienced in adapting from conquest to governance. The sellsword's nature, shaped by a life of violence and adventure, made him poorly suited for the patient work of building institutions and maintaining stability. His desire to return to warfare, to find enemies that could be fought and defeated rather than problems that required negotiation and compromise, represented a temptation that Daenerys herself sometimes felt, but could not afford to indulge. The decision to reopen the fighting pits of Meereen, made after extensive debate with advisors and petitioners, demonstrated the complexity of cultural change and the dangers of imposing foreign values on societies with deep-rooted traditions. Hizdahr zo Loraq's arguments that the pits provided one of the few sources of unity between former masters and slaves, that they represented tradition and spectacle that both groups had enjoyed, carried weight despite the obvious brutality and exploitation that the games involved. The compromise that emerged, allowing the pits to reopen under new regulations that emphasized voluntary participation and fair treatment, reflected an attempt to balance cultural sensitivity with moral principles. Yet even this carefully negotiated solution created new problems and controversies that highlighted the impossibility of satisfying all constituencies in a divided society. Former slaves who viewed any continuation of the games as a betrayal of the liberation they had fought to achieve, saw her decision as evidence that she cared more about appeasing former masters than protecting the vulnerable. Former masters who had lost wealth and status in the revolution viewed her regulations and oversight as unnecessary interference with traditions that had existed for centuries. The fighting pits became a microcosm of the larger struggle to create a society that could accommodate competing interests and values. The marriage to Hizdahr, undertaken as a political necessity to cement the compromise over the fighting pits and demonstrate her commitment to building bridges between former enemies, represented perhaps the most personal sacrifice that governance demanded. Her choice to bind herself to a man she did not love, whose values she did not share, and whose company she did not enjoy, illustrated the distance she had traveled from the girl who had once believed that queens could choose their own destiny. The wedding ceremony, conducted with all the pomp and circumstance that Meereenese tradition demanded, felt more like a funeral for her personal autonomy than a celebration of union. The continuation of her relationship with Daario despite her marriage created complications that extended beyond simple questions of personal fidelity to encompass broader issues of political stability and moral authority. Her attempt to maintain both connections, to fulfill her political obligations while preserving some space for personal happiness, reflected the human desire to have both duty and desire. Yet the contradictions inherent in this arrangement created vulnerabilities that her enemies could exploit and examples that undermined her moral authority in governing others. The growing threat represented by the Sons of the Harpy, emboldened by what they interpreted as weakness and division in her regime, culminated in the attack on the Great Games that nearly ended her life and definitely ended her illusions about the possibility of peaceful coexistence with the old order. The coordinated assault that targeted not just her but all those who had embraced the new Meereen demonstrated the sophisticated planning and broad support that the insurgency commanded. The death of Hizdahr during the attack removed one political complication while creating others, as his murder eliminated a bridge between communities that had already proven difficult to connect. The return of Drogon during the crisis, his dramatic intervention to save her life and scatter her enemies, provided both rescue and revelation about the nature of the bond between them. Her decision to climb onto his back and fly away from the chaos represented both escape and abandonment, saving her life while leaving behind the city and people she had sworn to protect. The flight from the fighting pit marked the end of one phase of her rule in Meereen and the beginning of another that would require her to confront even more fundamental questions about power, responsibility, and the price of justice in an unjust world. The capture by Khal Moro's Khalasar, Following her separation from Drogon in the Dothraki Sea, brought her story full circle to the people who had first taught her about strength and survival. Yet she returned to them not as the frightened bride who had once needed protection, but as the legendary Khaleesi who had walked through fire and emerged with dragons. The challenge now would be to translate that legend into the kind of influence that could shape the Dothraki into an instrument for the larger changes she envisioned for the world. The confrontation with Khal Moro's warriors provided Daenerys with her first opportunity to test whether the legends that had grown around her name carried sufficient weight to protect her from the brutal realities of Dothraki law. The Blood Riders who had captured her spoke of the strange woman they had found wandering alone in the grasslands with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, unaware that they had taken prisoner the most famous Khaleesi in their people's history. Their crude comments about her appearance and their obvious intentions regarding her fate demonstrated that reputation alone would not be sufficient to ensure her survival. Khal Moro himself proved to be a more complex figure than his followers, displaying both the casual cruelty expected of a Dothraki leader and a shrewd intelligence that recognized potential value when he encountered it. His initial assessment of Daenerys as suitable for his bed showed typical male dominance, but his willingness to listen when she spoke revealed a pragmatic mind that understood the importance of gathering information before making final decisions. The tension between his desires and his curiosity would ultimately determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. The revelation of her identity as the widow of Khal Drogo transformed the entire dynamic of her captivity, invoking laws and customs that even the most powerful Khal could not simply ignore. The Dothraki reverence for the memory of great leaders, combined with their strict observance of traditions regarding the treatment of widowed Khaleesi, provided her with protections that no amount of personal charm or political maneuvering could have achieved. Yet these same laws that saved her from immediate violation also sealed her fate in ways that might prove equally confining. The journey to Vaes Dothrak, undertaken as prisoner rather than honored guest, allowed Daenerys to observe how dramatically the Dothraki world had changed since her first pilgrimage to the Holy City. The khalasar that escorted her had grown fat and comfortable through raids on settled peoples, their success making them confident in their superiority over the soft civilizations they periodically plundered. Yet this prosperity had also bred complacency and a lack of the fierce unity that had once made the Horse Lords the terror of the known world. Her arrival at the Temple of the Dosh Khaleen provided a stark reminder of the fate that awaited all Khaleesi who outlived their husbands according to ancient custom. The widowed queens who stripped her of the clothes and jewelry that marked her royal status were themselves prisoners of tradition, their wisdom and experience wasted in ceremonial seclusion while the world beyond the Holy City continued to evolve without their guidance. Their collective resignation to meaningless ritual represented everything that Daenerys had learned to despise about systems that valued conformity over achievement. The High Priestess of the Dosh Khaleen delivered the judgment that custom demanded with the weary authority of someone who had overseen countless such ceremonies. Her recitation of Daenerys's crimes, particularly the violation of law that had kept her from immediately joining their order upon Drogo's death, carried the weight of religious orthodoxy that brooked no argument or appeal. Yet beneath the formal condemnation lay recognition that this particular Khaleesi represented something unprecedented in their experience. The other widowed queens displayed varying degrees of hostility and curiosity toward the newcomer, whose reputation had reached even their cloistered halls. Some resented her mixed blood and foreign origins, viewing her presence as contamination of their pure Dothraki heritage. Others found themselves intrigued by stories of dragons and conquest that suggested possibilities beyond the narrow confines of their traditional existence. This division among the Dosh Khaleen created opportunities that a skilled manipulator might exploit, though the risks of failure remained catastrophically high. The friendship that developed with Ornella, a young Lazarene woman who had been taken from her village as a child and eventually elevated to Khaleesi before her husband's death, provided Daenerys with both emotional support and practical intelligence about the political dynamics within the temple. The girl's story, marked by loss and adaptation but also by survival and quiet dignity, reminded Daenerys that strength could take many forms and that even the most oppressive systems contained possibilities for resistance and change. The rescue attempt planned by Jorah and Dario, well-intentioned though it was, represented exactly the kind of conventional solution that would have doomed them all to failure and death. Their assumption that she needed saving, that her situation was simply another problem to be solved through violence and escape, demonstrated their fundamental misunderstanding of both Dothraki culture and her own evolved approach to seemingly impossible challenges. The plan they proposed would have made her a fugitive for life, forever looking over her shoulder for pursuing Khals who would never forgive such a violation of sacred law. Her counter-proposal to use the gathering of Khals for the Kalar Veshvan as an opportunity to assert leadership over the entire Dothraki people represented a characteristically audacious gambit that turned apparent weakness into a potential strength. Rather than fleeing from the judgment that awaited her, she would embrace the confrontation and transform it into a platform for advancing her larger vision of conquest and liberation. The plan required perfect timing, absolute commitment, and a level of personal risk that would have terrified anyone less convinced of her own destiny. The Kalar Veshvan itself, the great gathering of Khals that occurred only rarely in Dothraki history, provided a unique opportunity to address the entire leadership structure of the Horse Lords at once. Never before had so many powerful men gathered in one place, their combined authority representing the accumulated might of dozens of Khalasars and hundreds of thousands of warriors. The decision to confront them directly rather than seeking accommodation or compromise reflected her growing confidence in both her own abilities and the righteousness of her cause. Her speech to the assembled Khals, delivered with the same fearless conviction that had carried her through every crisis she had faced, challenged not just their authority, but the entire foundation of their culture's acceptance of limitations. The accusation that they had grown small and weak, content to raid villages rather than attempt great conquests, struck at the core of their self-image as the world's greatest warriors. Her claim that she would lead them herself represented either magnificent courage or suicidal madness, depending on one's perspective. Khal Moro's response to her challenge, threatening rape and mutilation before the entire assembly, revealed both his fury at her defiance and his fundamental inability to conceive of a world where women might exercise real power. His crude threats, delivered with the casual brutality that characterized his rule, were intended to humiliate her into submission while demonstrating to the other Khals that he remained fully in control of the situation. The laughter that greeted his words showed how completely the assembled leaders misunderstood the true nature of the threat they faced. The calm smile that crossed Daenerys' face as Moro delivered his threats provided the first hint that events were about to take an unexpected turn. Her declaration that the Khals would die where they sat, spoken with absolute certainty and complete lack of fear, might have sounded like the desperate bravado of someone facing inevitable doom. Yet her tone and demeanor suggested knowledge of something that none of the assembled men could imagine. Confidence, born of preparation rather than mere defiance. The overturning of the braziers that provided the temple's only light created both immediate chaos and the beginning of a catastrophe that would consume everything the Khals thought they understood about power and gender. The flames that spread rapidly through the ancient wooden structure were no accident of desperation, but the culmination of careful planning that had required both supernatural confidence and meticulous attention to detail. As fire began to consume the building that had witnessed the election of Khals for generations, the true scope of her ambition became clear. The desperate attempts of the trapped Khals to escape the spreading flames revealed men who had spent their lives dealing death to others but had never seriously contemplated their own mortality. Their panic as they discovered the barred doors, the corpses of their guards lying outside as evidence that escape had been denied them, transformed warriors who had terrorized continents into frightened animals, clawing uselessly at obstacles they could not overcome. The fire that consumed them burned away not just their lives, but the certainty that had sustained their entire worldview. Khal Moro's final confrontation with Daenerys, his last attempt to assert physical dominance even as flames closed in around them, represented the death throes of an old order that had never imagined its own obsolescence. His effort to reach her through the spreading fire spoke to both his personal fury and his inability to accept that the world had fundamentally changed in ways that made his kind of power meaningless. The brazier she pushed onto him, completed not just his destruction, but the symbolic overthrow of everything he represented. The emergence from the burning temple provided one of the most powerful demonstrations of supernatural authority in recorded history, surpassing even her previous resurrection from Drogo's funeral pyre. The sight of a woman walking naked and unburnt from flames that had consumed the most powerful men in Dothraki society challenged every assumption about the natural order that her audience had ever held. The fact that she had orchestrated their deaths while remaining untouched by the fire that killed them elevated her beyond the realm of ordinary leadership into something approaching divinity. The immediate prostration of the assembled Dothraki, beginning with the Dosh Khaleen and spreading through the watching Khalasari, represented more than simple recognition of her power. Their submission acknowledged that they had witnessed something that transcended conventional understanding, a demonstration of forces that placed her beyond challenge by any mortal authority. The bows that rippled through the crowd like waves marked not just political surrender but spiritual awakening to a new reality. The delayed submission of Jorah and Daario, who approached through the crowd of kneeling Dothraki before finally bending their own knees, highlighted the complex relationship between personal loyalty and recognition of transcendent authority. These men, who had followed her through countless dangers and supported her through political crises, now found themselves confronting evidence that she possessed abilities that exceeded their previous understanding. Their decision to kneel represented both continued loyalty and acknowledgement that she had evolved beyond their ability to protect or guide her. The formal gratitude she expressed to Jorah for his years of service, tempered by recognition that his multiple returns from exile had created a problem requiring resolution, demonstrated her growing sophistication in managing the personal relationships that complicated her political authority. His confession of grayscale, the deadly disease that marked him as both tragic figure and potential threat to others, added urgency to decisions that might otherwise have been postponed indefinitely. The revelation that her most devoted servant was slowly dying from a condition contracted in service to her cause created emotional complications that threatened to undermine her newfound position of strength. Her command that Jorah find a cure rather than simply departing to die alone reflected both her personal attachment and her practical understanding that capable advisors were too valuable to waste. The promise that she would need him when she claimed the Iron Throne provided both motivation for his quest and acknowledgement that her ultimate objectives remained unchanged despite the supernatural demonstrations that had elevated her status among the Dothraki. Their embrace, witnessed by thousands of her new followers, served as public confirmation that personal loyalty continued to matter even as her authority took on increasingly mythical dimensions. The journey back toward Meereen provided opportunities for Daenerys to consolidate her new position while planning for the challenges that lay ahead. The conversations with Daario about logistics and strategy revealed both the practical difficulties of transporting massive armies across water and the enormous scope of her revised ambitions. The Dothraki horde that now followed her represented military potential on a scale that could reshape the political balance of both Essos and Westeros, but harnessing that potential would require resources and planning that exceeded anything she had previously attempted. Daario's estimate of the 1,000 ships needed to transport her combined forces highlighted one of the most significant obstacles standing between her current position and her ultimate objectives. The naval requirements alone exceeded the capabilities of most kingdoms, while the logistics of feeding and organizing such massive numbers during transport presented challenges that had defeated previous would-be conquerors. His observation that she was more conqueror than queen reflected both admiration for her achievements and subtle questioning of whether her talents were better suited to war than peace. Her assertion that she would take what was hers rather than negotiate for it demonstrated the confidence that her recent triumphs had instilled, but it also revealed a growing tendency toward solutions based on force rather than diplomacy. The woman who had once sought to build bridges between former enemies now spoke with the certainty of someone who had learned to see obstacles as targets for destruction rather than problems requiring negotiation. This evolution toward more direct action reflected both her accumulated frustrations with compromise and her growing faith in her ability to impose her will through supernatural means. The dramatic return to Meereen, accomplished by riding Drogon directly to the Great Pyramid, while her assembled forces followed by land, provided a spectacular demonstration of her enhanced authority and capabilities. The sight of their queen descending from the sky on the back of a fully grown dragon sent a clear message to both supporters and enemies about the fundamental changes in the balance of power. The dragon that had once been barely larger than a house cat now possessed the size and strength to serve as both mount and weapon of war. The reunion with Tyrion Missandei and Grey Worm in the Pyramid's council chamber provided opportunities to assess how well her closest advisors had managed the city in her absence, while also revealing their reactions to the changes they observed in her. Their initial mistaking of her aerial arrival for an attack highlighted the tensions that had developed during her disappearance, while their obvious relief at her return demonstrated the continued importance of her personal presence in maintaining stability. The reports they provided about the siege and their diplomatic efforts revealed both the challenges they had faced and the limitations of governing without her direct authority. The return to Dragonstone after years of exile and conquest represented more than a simple homecoming for Daenerys. It marked the beginning of the final phase of her long journey toward the Iron Throne. The ancient fortress, where she had been born during the storm that gave her the name Stormborn, now served as the perfect staging ground for the invasion that would either restore her family's dynasty or end her story in failure and death. The black volcanic stone of her ancestors' seat seemed to pulse with the same dark energy that flowed through her dragon's veins, connecting her to a legacy of fire and blood that stretched back to the doom of Valyria itself. Walking through the halls where Aegon the Conqueror had planned his conquest of Westeros 3 centuries before, Daenerys felt the weight of history and expectation settling upon her shoulders like a mantle of destiny. The painted table that dominated the castle's war room, with its detailed map of the 7 kingdoms carved from wood and decorated with precious stones, provided a tangible representation of the realm she intended to claim. Each kingdom, each castle, each river and mountain range carved into that ancient table would soon feel the presence of dragons for the first time in generations. The initial War Council meeting in the chamber of the painted table brought together advisors whose combined wisdom and experience represented the accumulated knowledge of both Essos and Westeros. Tyrion's understanding of the political landscape, gained through years of navigating the treacherous waters of King's Landing, complemented Varys's network of spies and informants that extended into every corner of the 7 kingdoms. Yet for all their knowledge of the realm's current state, both men struggled to comprehend the scale of the forces now arrayed behind their queen's banner. Olenna Tyrell's presence at these councils provided a voice of hard-won experience that challenged some of the more cautious approaches favored by Tyrion and other advisors. The Queen of Thorns, having survived decades of political maneuvering and witnessed the rise and fall of multiple dynasties, brought a perspective shaped by the understanding that power was something to be seized and held, rather than negotiated and shared. Her advice to be a dragon rather than a sheep resonated with Daenerys' own instincts, even when it conflicted with the more diplomatic approaches suggested by others. The arrival of Jon Snow at Dragonstone created a dynamic that none of the carefully planned strategies had anticipated. The King in the North's request for dragonglass, a substance that existed in abundance on the island but had little apparent value to most observers, provided the first glimpse into threats that extended far beyond the political struggles consuming the 7 kingdoms. His claims about an army of the dead marching south seemed like the ravings of a madman or the desperate lies of someone seeking to avoid bending the knee. Yet something in his manner suggested truth that was stranger than fiction. The meeting between 2 claimants to royal authority revealed immediate tension between competing concepts of legitimacy and leadership. Daenerys' expectation that Jon would acknowledge her birthright and bend the knee encountered his equally firm conviction that the North had chosen him as king and that he owed his primary loyalty to those who had placed their trust in his leadership. The clash between inherited authority and elected mandate reflected broader questions about the nature of political power that neither ruler had fully considered before their encounter. Jon's obvious discomfort with the titles and ceremonial aspects of kingship, contrasted with his passionate advocacy for his people's safety, revealed a leader whose authority rested on service rather than ambition. His reluctance to engage in the political maneuvering that had consumed most of Westeros's great houses marked him as fundamentally different from the players in the Game of Thrones that Daenerys had expected to encounter. This difference, initially frustrating to someone accustomed to dealing with those who sought power for its own sake, gradually became one of his most compelling characteristics. The developing relationship between Daenerys and Jon unfolded against the backdrop of military campaigns that tested both her strategic thinking and her commitment to the principles she claimed to champion. The assault on Casterly Rock, executed according to Tyrion's detailed knowledge of the fortress's weaknesses, achieved tactical success, while failing to deliver the strategic advantages that the plan had promised. The discovery that the Lannister army had abandoned the stronghold to strike at Highgarden demonstrated that her enemies possessed strategic thinking that matched her own. The loss of Olenna Tyrell, poisoned by Jaime Lannister after the fall of Highgarden, deprived Daenerys of both a crucial ally and a voice of practical wisdom that had helped balance the more theoretical approaches favored by her other advisors. The Queen of Thorns' final revelation about her role in Joffrey's death, delivered as a parting shot at Cersei Lannister, demonstrated the depths of planning and patience that political survival required in Westeros. Her death marked the end of an era and the elimination of someone whose understanding of power's realities had begun to influence Daenerys' own approach to conquest and governance. The loot train attack provided Daenerys with her first opportunity to demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of combining Dothraki mobility with dragonfire against traditional Westerosi military formations. The sight of Drogon soaring over the battlefield while her Khalasar swept through broken ranks created a spectacle of destruction that announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare in the Seven Kingdoms. The speed and completeness of the victory validated her decision to embrace more direct approaches to conflict resolution, while also revealing the terrible costs that such methods imposed on those who stood in her way. The aftermath of the battle, with its fields littered with the dead and dying, forced Daenerys to confront the human consequences of the power she wielded. The offer of mercy to surviving soldiers, contingent upon their willingness to bend the knee and join her cause, represented an attempt to balance the need for decisive action with her desire to be seen as a liberator rather than a destroyer. Yet the fate of those who refused her offer, particularly Randall and Dickon Tarly, tested both her resolve and her advisors' faith in her judgment. The execution of the Tarly lords by dragonfire, carried out despite Tyrion's pleas for alternative punishments, demonstrated Daenerys' growing willingness to use fear as a tool of governance. Her justification that she was answering injustice with justice rang hollow to those who remembered her earlier promises about breaking the wheel of oppression rather than simply putting herself at its center. The flames that consumed father and son served as a warning to all who witnessed them about the price of defying the Dragon Queen's authority. Jon's reaction to her methods of dealing with opposition provided one of the clearest illustrations of the fundamental differences in their approaches to leadership. His emphasis on mercy and the importance of inspiring loyalty through protection rather than fear reflected values shaped by years of defending the wall and protecting those who could not protect themselves. Their debates about the proper use of power revealed two leaders whose experiences had led them to dramatically different conclusions about the relationship between strength and justice. The growing attraction between Daenerys and Jon, developing despite their political disagreements and competing claims to authority, added personal stakes to decisions that affected the fate of kingdoms. Their mutual recognition of qualities that set each apart from the typical power seekers who dominated Westerosi politics created a connection that transcended mere political alliance. Yet this personal bond also created vulnerabilities that their enemies might exploit and complications that threatened to undermine the strategic thinking that both their causes required. The mission beyond the wall, undertaken at Jon's insistence and supported by Daenerys despite her advisors' objections, represented a leap of faith that tested her growing trust in his judgment and character. The decision to allow him to risk his life in pursuit of evidence that might convince Cersei to join their fight against the dead demonstrated either remarkable strategic thinking or dangerous emotional compromise. The waiting period while he traveled into the lands beyond civilization forced her to confront how much his survival had come to matter to her personally. The desperate flight north to rescue Jon and his companions, undertaken against Tyrion's counsel and at enormous risk to herself and her dragons, marked the point where personal attachment overrode strategic calculation in her decision-making. The sight of Viserion falling beneath the Night King's spear, the first of her children to die since their birth in Khal Drogo's funeral pyre, created wounds that would never fully heal. The loss of one dragon to save the life of one man represented exactly the kind of trade that no ruler could afford to make repeatedly and survive. The aftermath of Viserion's death, with Jon's obvious guilt and her own grief threatening to overwhelm strategic thinking, brought them closer together through shared loss and mutual responsibility for the catastrophe that had befallen them. His attempt to shoulder all blame for her dragon's death met her insistence that she had needed to see the threat for herself, that some truths could only be learned through direct experience, regardless of the costs involved. Their conversation in the ship's cabin, marked by physical intimacy and emotional vulnerability, sealed a bond that would influence every subsequent decision both rulers made. The Dragon Pit meeting provided the stage for one of the most complex diplomatic negotiations in Westerosi history, bringing together enemies who had spent years trying to destroy each other in service of a cause that transcended their individual ambitions. The presentation of evidence about the army of the dead, demonstrated through the captured wight that Sandor Clegane unleashed upon the assembled nobility, and achieved its intended effect of shocking even the most cynical observers into acknowledging the reality of supernatural threats. Yet even this dramatic proof of dangers beyond political calculation failed to unite the assembled factions completely. Cersei's conditional agreement to join the fight against the dead, contingent upon Jon Snow's promise to remain neutral in future conflicts between her and Daenerys, created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to unravel the fragile alliance before it could be tested in battle. Jon's honesty about his existing commitment to Daenerys, delivered at the worst possible moment from a strategic standpoint, demonstrated either admirable integrity or catastrophic political naivety. The collapse of negotiations that had seemed on the verge of success highlighted the challenges of building trust between parties whose enmity ran deeper than mere political disagreement. The private conversations between Daenerys and Jon during their voyage north provided opportunities to explore the growing complexity of their relationship and its implications for both their personal happiness and their public responsibilities. Their discussions about dragons and family legacy, about the loneliness of command and the weight of expectations, revealed two people who understood each other's burdens in ways that no one else could match. Yet these moments of intimacy also highlighted the fundamental contradiction between their public roles and their private desires. The revelation of Jon's true parentage, delivered by Sam Tarly and Bran Stark at the worst possible moment for all concerned, created complications that threatened to destroy both their personal relationship and their political alliance. The knowledge that Jon was not Ned Stark's bastard but rather Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne by the laws of succession that Daenerys had spent her life defending, challenged every assumption upon which she had built her identity and ambitions. The man she had come to love now represented the greatest threat to everything she had fought to achieve. The consummation of their relationship, occurring just as the truth about their blood connection remained hidden from them both, represented both the culmination of their growing attraction and the beginning of complications that would ultimately prove impossible to resolve. Their physical union, witnessed unknowingly by Tyrion as he approached her cabin, created new vulnerabilities and obligations that neither ruler was prepared to handle. The personal happiness they found in each other's arms came at a cost that would only become apparent when the full truth of their situation finally emerged. The arrival at Winterfell marked the beginning of the final phase of Daenerys' journey, bringing her into direct contact with the Stark family, whose loyalty Jon valued above all other considerations. The cold reception she received from the Northern Lords, suspicious of outsiders and resentful of any threat to Jon's authority, provided a stark reminder that conquest and acceptance were entirely different challenges. The dragons flying overhead, intended as a demonstration of power, instead served to emphasize her foreignness and the fear that her very presence inspired in those she hoped to protect. The Great Hall of Winterfell, where generations of Stark lords had dispensed justice and welcomed honored guests, now witnessed the awkward introduction between a dragon queen and the northern nobility who viewed her with barely concealed suspicion. Sansa Stark's measured courtesy, polite but cold, established the tone for a relationship that would prove as complex as any political alliance Daenerys had ever attempted to forge. The Lady of Winterfell's concerns about feeding such massive armies during the depths of winter reflected practical realities that military conquest could not solve, while her pointed questions about dragon dietary habits served as reminders that power brought responsibilities as well as privileges. The tension between the two queens extended beyond simple political maneuvering to encompass fundamental differences in approach to leadership and governance. Sansa's years of survival in King's Landing, followed by her experiences rebuilding the North after devastating wars, had taught her to value caution and planning over bold gestures and dramatic solutions. Her skepticism toward Daenerys reflected not personal animosity, but hard-won wisdom about the costs of trusting outsiders who promised easy answers to complex problems. Jon's attempts to bridge the growing divide between his sister and his lover revealed the impossible position he occupied between competing loyalties and expectations. His assurances that the North needed Daenerys' help to survive the coming battle carried weight with those who trusted his judgment, but they could not overcome the fundamental resistance of people who had learned through bitter experience that southern rulers brought nothing but suffering to their lands. The delicate balance he attempted to maintain satisfied no one completely, while creating vulnerabilities that more calculating enemies might exploit. The private moments between Daenerys and Jon provided temporary refuge from the political pressures that surrounded them, though even their most intimate conversations carried undercurrents of the larger conflicts that threatened to tear apart everything they had built together. Their flight on the dragons, soaring over the snow-covered landscape that Jon had known since childhood, offered a glimpse of the partnership and shared purpose that might have been possible under different circumstances. Yet even these moments of connection were shadowed by the growing awareness that their relationship existed in defiance of forces larger than their personal desires. The revelation of Jon's true parentage, delivered by Sam Tarly with all the tact of a man who had never learned to soften devastating news, shattered the foundation upon which both their personal relationship and their political alliance had been built. The knowledge that he was not the bastard of Winterfell but Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne by every law of succession that Daenerys had spent her life defending, transformed the man she loved into the greatest threat to everything she had fought to achieve. The timing of this revelation, just as they prepared to face an enemy that threatened all human life, could not have been worse for either their personal happiness or their military effectiveness. Jon's struggle to process this information, to reconcile the identity he had always known with the destiny that had been hidden from him since birth, created internal conflicts that affected his ability to lead just when decisive leadership was most desperately needed. His instinctive rejection of the crown that was rightfully his, born of genuine humility rather than false modesty, demonstrated the very qualities that made him worthy of the authority he refused to claim. Yet this nobility of character, admirable though it was, provided no solution to the practical problems that his existence as Aegon Targaryen created for everyone who depended on him for guidance and protection. Daenerys' reaction to the revelation combined personal devastation with strategic calculation in ways that revealed both her humanity and her growing isolation from normal human emotions. The loss of the man she thought she knew, replaced by someone whose very existence challenged her deepest beliefs about her own purpose and worth, struck at the core of her identity as surely as any physical wound. Yet even in the midst of this emotional crisis, part of her mind continued to assess the political implications of his claim and the challenges it would create for her own ambitions. The approach of the army of the dead provided external pressure that temporarily suppressed these personal and political conflicts in favor of immediate survival needs. The sight of the Night King's forces spreading across the northern landscape like a tide of extinction focused everyone's attention on threats that dwarfed individual ambitions and dynastic disputes. Yet even this ultimate enemy could not completely erase the tensions that Jon's true parentage had created, and the knowledge that survival might only postpone rather than resolve their fundamental conflicts cast shadows over their preparations for battle. The Battle of Winterfell itself represented the culmination of everything Daenerys had learned about warfare, leadership, and the terrible costs that victory sometimes demanded. The sight of the Dothraki charge disappearing into darkness, their flaming arrows extinguished by an enemy that turned courage and skill into meaningless gestures, provided a brutal education in the limits of conventional military thinking when facing supernatural foes. The loss of so many warriors who had followed her across the world struck at both her tactical capabilities and her emotional resilience in ways that would influence every subsequent decision she made. The aerial battle with the Night King, fought on Dragonback above the chaos of ground combat, tested her skills as both warrior and commander, while forcing her to confront an enemy unlike any she had previously faced. The undead dragon that had once been Viserion, transformed by dark magic into a weapon of destruction turned against his former family, represented a perversion of everything she held sacred about the bond between dragons and their mother. The necessity of fighting her own child, corrupted by forces beyond her understanding or control, created psychological wounds that mere physical victory could never heal. The moment when Dragonfire proved ineffective against the Night King himself forced Daenerys to confront the limitations of the power that had carried her through every previous crisis. The flames that had destroyed slave masters and enemy armies, that had announced her authority and enforced her will across 2 continents, meant nothing to this ultimate enemy who existed beyond the natural laws that governed mortal beings. The realization that her greatest weapon was useless against her greatest foe created a sense of helplessness that she had not experienced since her earliest days of exile and powerlessness. The final assault on the Godswood, where the Night King sought to destroy Bran Stark and thereby eliminate the memory of the world itself, forced Daenerys to make desperate choices about resource allocation and tactical priorities. Her decision to clear a path for Jon through the ranks of newly risen Whites, using Drogon's fire to burn through obstacles that would have otherwise prevented his advance, demonstrated her continued commitment to their shared cause, despite the personal tensions that had developed between them. Yet, even this moment of cooperation was tinged with the knowledge that their fundamental conflicts remained unresolved. The death of Jorah Mormont, occurring as he defended her life with his own when Drogon was forced to flee and leave her vulnerable to attack, represented the loss of her most devoted companion and longest-serving advisor. The man who had followed her from the beginning of her journey, who had offered counsel and protection through every crisis and triumph, died as he had lived in her service, asking nothing and giving everything. His final moments, spent ensuring her survival rather than seeking his own safety, provided a standard of loyalty and sacrifice that would make her increasingly impatient with those whose commitment seemed conditional or self-serving. The victory celebration in Winterfell's Great Hall, while acknowledging the magnitude of their achievement against impossible odds, could not completely mask the divisions and tensions that survival had temporarily suppressed. Daenerys' toast to Arya Stark, recognizing the young woman whose unexpected intervention had made victory possible, demonstrated her continued ability to acknowledge others' contributions despite her own need for recognition and praise. Yet the enthusiastic response that greeted Tormund's praise of Jon Snow, compared to the more measured reaction to her own presence, highlighted the growing isolation she felt even among those she had helped save. The renewed attempt at physical intimacy with Jon, initiated in the aftermath of their shared triumph, encountered obstacles that had nothing to do with external enemies or political complications. His inability to separate their blood relationship from his desire for her, despite her attempts to dismiss such concerns as irrelevant to their deeper connection, created a barrier that personal affection could not overcome. The rejection, gentle though it was, struck at her confidence and desirability in ways that military defeats and political setbacks never had. Jon's continued insistence on telling his sisters about his true parentage, despite her desperate pleas for secrecy that might have preserved both their relationship and her claim to the throne, demonstrated either admirable integrity or catastrophic naivety about the realities of political survival. His faith that truth would somehow resolve their conflicts rather than create new ones reflected a worldview shaped by honor and honesty that had little relevance to the brutal calculations that governed dynastic politics. Yet his refusal to lie to those he loved, admirable though the impulse might be, sealed both their fates in ways that neither fully understood at the time. The conversation with Sansa that revealed Jon's secret, conducted in the crypts beneath Winterfell where their ancestors lay buried, unleashed forces that would ultimately prove beyond any individual's ability to control. Sansa's decision to share this information with others, motivated by her own political calculations and her genuine belief that Jon would make a better ruler than Daenerys, set in motion a chain of betrayals that would transform allies into enemies and friends into rivals. The web of competing loyalties and conflicting ambitions that resulted from this revelation created exactly the kind of political chaos that their enemies could exploit. Varys's immediate recognition of the opportunity that Jon's parentage represented, combined with his growing concerns about Daenerys's methods and mental state, transformed him from supporter into active conspirator against the queen he had once served faithfully. The Spider's belief that Jon Snow would prove a more suitable ruler, based on both his character and his gender, in a culture that still favored male authority, led him to betray the trust that Daenerys had placed in him, despite their complicated history. His letters to various lords throughout the Seven Kingdoms, attempting to build support for Jon's claim, represented exactly the kind of political maneuvering that Daenerys had hoped to avoid through decisive action and overwhelming force. The loss of Rhaegal to Euron Greyjoy's Scorpions, occurring during what should have been a triumphant return to Dragonstone, struck another devastating blow at both her military capabilities and her emotional stability. The death of her second dragon, shot down by enemies she had failed to detect until too late, revealed dangerous overconfidence in her own abilities and insufficient attention to the tactical innovations that her enemies had developed in response to the threat that dragons posed. The sight of Rhaegal falling into the sea, his massive form disappearing beneath waters that had once seemed like pathways to victory, marked another step in her transformation from confident conqueror to desperate survivor. The capture of Missandei during the same engagement that claimed Rhaegal's life deprived Daenerys of both a trusted advisor and one of the few people who had known her during her years of growth and learning in Essos. The young woman who had translated for kings and queens, who had witnessed the liberation of Slaver's Bay and the birth of a new kind of justice in the ancient world, now became a pawn in Cersei Lannister's final gambit to preserve her hold on power. The loss of someone who represented her idealistic period, when liberation and justice had seemed achievable through determination and righteousness, left another hole in the emotional support system that had sustained her through previous crises. The parley outside King's Landing, where Cersei demonstrated her contempt for diplomatic convention by executing Missandei in full view of those who had come to negotiate, provided the final provocation that transformed Daenerys' grief and frustration into murderous rage. Missandei's last word, Dracarys, spoken defiantly before her execution, served as both blessing and command, authorization for the fire and blood that would follow. The death of this innocent woman, killed purely to inflict emotional pain on her former queen, represented everything that Daenerys had learned to hate about those who wielded power without mercy or justice. The execution of Varys for his treason, carried out by Drogon's fire on the beaches of Dragonstone, demonstrated how far Daenerys had traveled from the young woman who had once sought to build bridges between former enemies. The flames that consumed her former advisor announced to all who witnessed them that betrayal would no longer be tolerated, that the time for patience and second chances had ended. Yet even this decisive action could not undo the damage that his conspiracy had already accomplished, or restore the trust that his betrayal had shattered. The final conversation with Jon before the assault on King's Landing revealed a woman who had been pushed beyond the limits of her emotional endurance, whose capacity for mercy and forgiveness had been exhausted by repeated betrayals and losses. Her acknowledgement that love had failed her, that she commanded only fear rather than the devotion that came naturally to him, marked her acceptance of isolation as the price of the power she still intended to wield. The choice between love and fear, presented as inevitable rather than optional, reflected her growing belief that strength alone could accomplish what cooperation and compromise had failed to achieve. The moment when the bells of King's Landing rang out in surrender, signaling that everything she had fought for was finally within her grasp, should have represented the culmination of her life's work and the vindication of every sacrifice she had made. Instead, the sound of those bells served as the trigger for a descent into madness, that had been building through months of loss, betrayal, and isolation. The realization that victory could be achieved without the destruction she had planned. That her enemies might surrender without being forced to acknowledge the justice of her cause, proved paradoxically unbearable to someone whose identity had become inseparable from the role of avenging angel. The destruction of King's Landing that followed represented not policy or strategy, but the unleashing of accumulated rage and grief that had found no other outlet. The dragonfire that consumed surrendering soldiers and innocent civilians alike served no military purpose and achieved no political objective beyond the satisfaction of inflicting suffering on a world that had caused her so much pain. The woman who had once been called Breaker of Chains had become the very thing she had sworn to destroy. A tyrant who ruled through terror and justified atrocity through appeals to a greater good that existed only in her own tortured imagination. The aftermath of King's Landing's destruction revealed a city transformed into something unrecognizable, where the very stones seemed to weep ash and the air itself carried the stench of death that no wind could dispel. The Red Keep, seat of Targaryen power for 3 centuries, stood partially ruined among the devastation. Its red walls now blackened by the same dragonfire that had once built the dynasty's dominion over Westeros. In the throne room, where Aegon the Conqueror had first established his rule, snow fell through gaps torn in the ceiling by Drogon's flames, creating the very scene that Daenerys had witnessed in her vision at the House of the Undying so many years before. The Iron Throne itself, that monument to conquest and dominion that had dominated the political landscape of Westeros for generations, stood untouched amid the destruction that surrounded it. The 1,000 swords that formed its twisted mass seemed to mock the ambitions of those who had died trying to claim it, while the steps leading to its seat bore witness to the blood that had been shed in its pursuit. For Daenerys, walking through the ruins of her family's ancient seat, this chair represented both the fulfillment of her life's purpose and the validation of every sacrifice she had made in its pursuit. The speech she delivered to her assembled forces in the courtyard of the Red Keep revealed a mind that had retreated into justifications that bore no relationship to the reality of what she had accomplished. Her declaration that they had liberated King's Landing, that the people who had died in the flames were now free from tyranny, demonstrated how completely she had lost touch with any moral framework that others might recognize or accept. The cheers that greeted her words from Dothraki and Unsullied alike showed how thoroughly she had surrounded herself with those whose loyalty transcended questions of right and wrong. Her announcement that their work was far from finished, that liberation must be brought to every corner of the world that still groaned under the weight of oppressive rulers, revealed ambitions that extended far beyond the Iron Throne she had originally sought to claim. The woman who had once dreamed of ruling the 7 kingdoms now spoke of conquering all the known world, of breaking every wheel and chain until nothing remained but her own vision of perfect justice. This expansion of her goals, unlimited by practical constraints or moral boundaries, suggested a madness that had moved beyond mere cruelty into realms of megalomaniacal fantasy. Tyrion's horror at the devastation he witnessed, combined with his public rejection of the hand's pin that had symbolized his service to her cause, provided the final break between Daenerys and the last advisor who might have guided her back toward reason and restraint. His act of defiance, throwing away the symbol of his office while standing among the ashes of the innocents she had killed, represented both personal courage and political suicide. Yet for a man who had spent his life navigating the treacherous waters of power politics, this moment of moral clarity seemed to provide relief rather than fear. The arrest and imprisonment of Tyrion, ordered immediately after his public display of dissent, demonstrated that Daenerys would no longer tolerate even implicit criticism of her methods or objectives. The man who had crafted the strategies that brought her to power, who had counseled moderation when her impulses led toward excess, now joined the ranks of those who had supposedly betrayed her vision of a better world. His fate, like that of so many others who had served her faithfully, would depend entirely on her mood and her assessment of whether mercy served her larger purposes. Jon's arrival in the ruined throne room, where Daenerys stood contemplating the seat that had cost so many lives to win, provided the final confrontation between 2 incompatible visions of leadership and justice. His obvious horror at what she had done to the city and its people met her serene confidence that history would vindicate her choices, that the temporary suffering she had caused would pale beside the eternal peace her rule would bring. The distance between their moral frameworks had become so vast that meaningful communication seemed impossible. Her attempt to justify the massacre by appealing to the greater good, to the peace that would supposedly follow once all opposition had been eliminated, revealed how completely she had embraced the logic that had driven every tyrant in history. The circular reasoning that defined anyone who opposed her as an enemy of justice and therefore deserving of death provided intellectual cover for atrocities that needed no external justification beyond her own will. The woman who had once wept for crucified children now spoke calmly of burning cities as necessary steps toward a better world. Jon's desperate appeals for mercy, his pleas that she show the people of King's Landing the same compassion she had once demonstrated toward the slaves of Slaver's Bay, encountered a mind that had moved beyond such considerations. Her response that mercy was a luxury that those building a better world could not afford revealed how thoroughly she had convinced herself that cruelty in service of her vision constituted the highest form of love. The transformation from liberator to destroyer was complete, justified by philosophies that placed abstract ideals above concrete human suffering. The final kiss they shared, ostensibly a gesture of reconciliation and renewed partnership, provided Jon with both the opportunity and the justification he needed to end the threat she represented to every living person in the world. The dagger that pierced her heart fulfilled the destiny that Melisandre had glimpsed in her flames, though not in the manner that anyone had expected or desired. The prince that was promised had indeed brought an end to the long night, but the darkness he banished was one that had taken root in the heart of someone he loved, rather than marching from the frozen wastes beyond the wall. Daenerys's final moments, spent in the arms of the man who had both loved and killed her, provided a glimpse of the confused and heartbroken woman who existed beneath the layers of justification and rage that had driven her to such extremes. Her expression of hurt and bewilderment as life faded from her violet eyes suggested that some part of her had never fully understood how she had traveled so far from the idealistic young woman who had once promised to protect innocent. Death came not as punishment for her crimes, but as release from a burden that had grown too heavy for any mortal soul to bear. Drogon's discovery of his mother's body provided one of the most poignant moments in the entire tragic saga. As the great dragon tried desperately to wake the woman who had given him life and purpose, his anguished roars echoed through the ruined throne room like a lament for innocence lost, while his futile attempts to rouse her demonstrated a loyalty that transcended the complex political calculations that had motivated her human followers. The bond between mother and dragon, pure and uncomplicated by questions of right and wrong, remained unbroken even by death itself. The dragon's response to Jon's presence beside his mother's body initially suggested the violent retribution that everyone expected, as Drogon's intelligence clearly recognized the man responsible for her death. Yet instead of incinerating the killer, the great beast turned his wrath upon the Iron Throne itself, melting the symbol of power that had ultimately destroyed the woman he served. The irony that a dragon's fire, which had built the Targaryen dynasty, now consumed its ultimate symbol, provided a fitting end to a story that had always been about the corrupting influence of absolute power. Drogon's departure with Daenerys' body, carrying her away from the scene of her final tragedy toward destinations unknown, ensured that her story would end in mystery rather than the degradation of public display and political exploitation. The great dragon's flight into the eastern sky suggested a return to the lands where she had first learned to rule, where the girl who had walked through fire had discovered her destiny among the dragons and the freed slaves who had called her mother. Whether he took her to rest among the ruins of Valyria or simply sought a place where grief could be processed away from human interference remained a question that would never be answered. The Great Council that convened in the Dragon Pit to determine the succession represented an unprecedented experiment in consensual governance, though one born of necessity rather than idealistic commitment to democratic principles. The assembled lords and ladies of Westeros, faced with the collapse of traditional legitimacy following Daenerys' death and Jon's exile, were forced to invent new methods of selecting rulers that had no precedent in their history. The irony that her destruction of King's Landing had inadvertently created the conditions for exactly the kind of political innovation she had claimed to champion was lost on none who participated in those deliberations. Bran the Broken's selection as king, based on his unique perspective and freedom from the personal ambitions that had driven previous rulers to destruction, fulfilled Tyrion's argument that the best leaders were often those who had no desire to lead. The young man who had traveled beyond the wall and returned with knowledge of humanity's deepest secrets brought to the throne a wisdom that transcended normal political calculations. Yet his elevation also represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Westerosi kingship, from hereditary right to consensual appointment based on perceived merit and supernatural insight. The establishment of an independent North under Sansa Stark's rule provided a practical solution to the problem of regional autonomy, while acknowledging that some wounds could not be healed through simple declarations of unity. The recognition that the North had earned the right to self-governance through its sacrifices during the wars against both the dead and the living offered a model for resolving similar tensions that might arise in other regions. This pragmatic acceptance of division as preferable to continued conflict represented exactly the kind of flexible thinking that had been absent from Daenerys's increasingly rigid worldview. Jon's exile to the Night's Watch. While technically a punishment for regicide, provided him with the opportunity to escape the political complications that his true parentage had created while returning to the institution that had first taught him about duty and sacrifice. The Black brothers who welcomed him back to Castle Black understood that his service there would be different from his previous tenure, marked by the weight of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. Yet the familiar rhythms of life on the Wall offered the possibility of finding peace through service to something larger than personal ambition or political maneuvering. The dispersal of Daenerys's forces following her death created ripple effects that would influence the future development of both Westeros and Essos for generations to come. The Dothraki, who chose to remain in the Seven Kingdoms rather than return to their homeland, brought new perspectives and customs that gradually enriched the cultural landscape of the realm. The Unsullied, who departed for Noth, seeking to honor their fallen queen's memory by protecting the peaceful people of Missandei's homeland, provided a more constructive outlet for their military skills than further conquest or domination. The economic and social reforms that gradually emerged from the ashes of the old system reflected many of the ideals that Daenerys had originally championed, though implemented through consensus and compromise rather than fire and blood. The abolition of slavery throughout the known world, accomplished through diplomatic pressure and economic incentives rather than military conquest, achieved her most important objective without the massive bloodshed that her methods had required. The irony that her death had made possible the very changes she had claimed to desire highlighted the tragic disconnect between her noble goals and the destructive methods she had chosen to pursue them. The songs that eventually commemorated her story struggled to reconcile the genuine good she had accomplished during her early career with the horror of her final actions, creating multiple versions that emphasized different aspects of her complex legacy. In Essos, she was remembered primarily as the breaker of chains who had freed millions from bondage and given them the opportunity to shape their own destinies. In Westeros, her memory was forever associated with the destruction of King's Landing and the tens of thousands who had died in her quest for a throne that ultimately brought her no happiness. The children who grew up in the aftermath of these events learned about power and its responsibilities through stories that emphasized the importance of wisdom, restraint, and the counsel of others rather than the individual heroism that had characterized earlier legends. The cautionary tale of the Dragon Queen who had saved the world from slavery only to threaten it with tyranny became a standard part of political education, designed to warn future leaders about the seductive dangers of absolute authority and the importance of maintaining connections to the people they served. The dragons themselves became creatures of legend once more, though their brief return had fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with magic and the supernatural. The knowledge that such beings could exist, that the ancient powers had not disappeared forever from the world, influenced everything from military planning to religious doctrine. Yet the association between dragons and the destruction of King's Landing also served as a reminder that power without wisdom inevitably led to tragedy, regardless of its source or magnitude. In the end, the story of Daenerys Targaryen served as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating the heights that human determination could achieve while illustrating the depths to which it could descend when untempered by humility and constrained by moral boundaries. Her journey from powerless exile to world-changing conqueror to mad tyrant contained lessons that would influence political thought and governmental structure for generations to come, ensuring that her impact on the world would long outlive the brief span of her actual reign.